Never go camping in the forests on reservations. Back when I was 13, my family lived in the city, but every summer I visited my relatives on the reservation. It was a tradition that had been going on since I was little. On this occasion, I was especially excited because I would get to spend more time with my cousins, Daniel, who was 14, Maya, who was my age, and little Jonah, who was 11. Their home was nestled deep within the woods, surrounded by towering pines and the sounds of nature. It was a world away from the city life I was used to. The air was fresh, the nights were quiet, and there was a sense of peace that's hard to find anywhere else. One evening after dinner, the four of us were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The adults were inside, chatting and laughing about whatever. Daniel turned to us with a mischievous grin. "Guys, what if we went camping tonight?" Mia raised an eyebrow. "You know Grandma and Grandpa wouldn't let us do that. They've told us 1,000,000 times not to go into the woods after dark." "Exactly," Daniel smirked. "That's why we won't tell them a thing." I could tell Jonah didn't like the sound of that. I don't know, what if we get caught? I was torn. The idea of a nighttime adventure sounded great, but disobeying our family didn't sit right with me. "You know, we could just ask first," I added. Daniel shook his head. "They'll just say no. Come on, it'll be fun. We'll set up a tent, tell stories, and we'll be back before sunrise, before they even know." Mia glanced at me. "What do you think, Alex?" I was hesitant, but then I thought about how memorable it could be. At the time, all the kids my age were saying YOLO. "All right, I'm in, but we have to be careful." Jonah sighed. "Fine, but if we get in trouble, it's on you, Daniel." We waited until everyone had gone to bed. Around midnight, the house was quiet, except for the soft sounds of our grandparents snoring. We grabbed what we needed and sneaked out the back door. The night was clear, and the moon cast a soft glow through the branches. The paths we knew so well during the day now felt creepy, which made it all the more exciting. After about 20 minutes, we found a small clearing near a creek, a spot we'd visited many times before. But at night, it felt like a whole new place. We worked together to set up a tent, though it was a bit of a struggle in the dark. Once everything was ready, we sat around a small battery-powered lantern. The soft light illuminated our faces, and the sounds of the forest added to the atmosphere, crickets chirping and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. "All right, who's got a good story?" Daniel asked, rubbing his hands together. "I do," Mia exclaimed. "Have you guys heard about the Raven Mocker?" Jonah shuddered. "Oh, I don't like that one." "Too bad," she teased. "So, the Raven Mocker is this evil spirit that steals the hearts of the sick and dying to add years to its own life. It can appear as a raven or take on human form, but only medicine men can see it." "That's creepy," I admitted. Daniel leaned in. "Well, how about this one? It's even scarier. Have you ever heard of the Deer Woman?" Mia rolled her eyes. "Daniel, you know that's just a story to keep kids from wandering off." "Whatever. They say she appears as a beautiful woman to lure people into the woods, but once you're deep enough, she reveals her true form, hooves for feet and the face of a stag." Jonah looked genuinely frightened. "Can we talk about something else?" I decided to lighten the mood. "How about the legend of the Star People? They're benevolent beings who came from the sky to teach our ancestors wisdom and knowledge." "That's not scary," Daniel objected. "Exactly." I smiled. Maybe we've had enough spooky stories for now. But Daniel wasn't done. He glanced around and lowered his voice. "You know, Grandpa told me something once, something he said was true." Mia gave him a wary look. "What are you talking about?" He paused for effect. "He said that when he was our age, he encountered a skinwalker." Instantly, the atmosphere changed. We all knew about skinwalkers, witches who could transform into animals using dark magic for evil purposes. It's a subject the elders rarely discuss, and when they do, it's with a sense of dread. "Daniel, I don't think we should talk about that," Mia whispered. "Come on, it's just a story," Jonah said, hugging his knees. "Maybe we should listen to Mia," I added, but now I was curious. "What did Grandpa say?" Daniel took a deep breath. He said that one night, he was out late helping his father gather wood. They got separated somehow. At one point, while searching, he saw a coyote standing on two legs. It was staring at him. At first, Grandpa thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then it began to walk toward him, its body twisting and contorting. "Stop it," Mia pleaded, but Daniel ignored her and continued. He froze, too scared to move. The coyote had the face of a man stretched over its skull. It whispered his name in a voice that wasn't human. Grandpa ran as fast as he could back home, and when he told his father, they performed a ceremony to protect him. Silence fell over us. Even the forest seemed to have gone quieter, as if it were listening with bated breath to his story. I felt a chill. "Why would you tell that story?" Mia snapped, clearly upset. "It's just a tale," Daniel said, though he looked a bit uneasy himself. Jonah's eyes were wide. "Do you think they're real?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but another part remembered the warnings from our elders. "I think we should just go to sleep," I finally said. We agreed and crawled into the tent. It was a tight fit, but we didn't mind. Being close felt safer somehow. At that moment, I lay there staring up at the tent's fabric. Shadows from the trees outside started to creep me out. It was hard to go to sleep. Every little sound outside startled me. Hours seemed to pass. I glanced at my watch. 3:15 a.m., still dark. I was starting to drift off at last when I heard it, a soft shuffling noise like someone dragging their feet through the underbrush. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, closer this time. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. Mia turned over and looked at me. "Hear what?" "Shh," Daniel hissed. "Listen." The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by a faint wheezing, like labored breathing. Then Jonah sat up, his eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" he mouthed. Daniel reached for his flashlight, his hands shaking. He gestured for us to stay quiet. Slowly, he unzipped a small part of the tent flap, just enough to peek outside. We crowded around him, each of us trying to see without making any noise. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trees. At first, we saw nothing, but then there was movement. Emerging from behind a tree was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had the body of a coyote, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were stretched too long, patches of fur were missing, and skin was pulled tightly over its bones. But the head was the worst part, the most horrifying. It was as if the flesh of a human face had been yanked over a coyote's skull and left there. Its eyes were sunken deep with a faint glow, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The creature moved in a jerky, unnatural way, circling our camp. Its wheezing breaths echoed in the stillness. It didn't seem aware of us, thankfully, but it was searching for something, its head twitching from side to side. Mia covered her mouth to stifle a scream. Jonah gripped my arm so tight it hurt. Daniel slowly lowered the flap and turned off the flashlight. "What do we do?" I whispered. "Stay quiet," Daniel replied. "Maybe it'll go away." We sat there, huddled closely together, listening as the creature continued to circle us. We waited for the longest time, the wheezing breaths drawing closer and closer, right outside the tent. "Help me," a raspy voice whispered from outside. I felt a surge of terror. It was mimicking human speech, but the voice was distorted and unnatural. "Please, help me." Jonah began to cry softly. Mia held his hand, her own eyes brimming with tears. "Don't respond," Daniel mouthed. The creature pressed against the tent fabric, so close we could see its shadow looming over us. Its smell was overwhelming, decay mixed with something like sulfur. "Why won't you help me?" it whispered, the voice barely more than a breath. I closed my eyes tightly, silently praying for it to leave. The wheezing continued for what felt like ages. Then, suddenly, the sounds began to fade. The shuffling moved away, the wheezing grew distant, and eventually, the forest returned to its natural symphony of nocturnal creatures. And yet, we didn't move. None of us dared to speak or even breathe too loudly. Dawn was still a couple of hours away, but the thought of stepping outside was terrifying. "Do you think it's gone?" Mia finally whispered. "I don't know," Daniel replied, swallowing hard. "We should wait until sunrise." We sat there, backs against the wall, fighting exhaustion. Sleep was impossible. Every so often, we'd hear a distant sound and tense right back up. But the creature didn't return. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we felt a collective relief. The darkness had been our enemy, but daylight brought safety, or at the very least, the illusion of it. "Let's pack up and go," I suggested. Quickly, we stuffed our sleeping bags into our backpacks, not bothering to fold anything properly. Exiting the tent, we looked around slowly and cautiously. The clearing looked innocent enough in the morning light, but the memory of the night's terror lingered. "Should we take the tent down?" Jonah asked. "Leave it," Daniel said. "We can come back for it later." We then made our way back home. The journey back felt way longer than before. When we finally exited the woods and approached the house, we saw our grandparents and parents waiting on the porch for us. Their faces held a mix of anger and worry. "Where have you been?" Grandma demanded, her hands on her hips. Daniel looked down and replied, We went camping." "After we explicitly told you not to?" Grandpa's voice was stern. Mia stepped forward. "We're sorry. We just thought it would be an adventure." Our parents ushered us inside. Once we were seated around the kitchen table, Grandpa looked at each of us intently. "Did anything happen out there?" he asked. We looked at each other, and finally I spoke up. "Yes, sir. We saw something that we can't really explain." Grandma sighed. "We warned you for a reason. What did you see?" Grandpa pressed, sounding like he already knew what we were going to say. Daniel began to describe the creature we saw in detail: the distorted body, the human-like face, the wheezing, and the voice. Eventually, Grandpa nodded. "It's as I feared." "Was that a skinwalker?" Jonah asked timidly. Grandpa shot him a look so quick that Jonah winced. "Do not speak of it, yes? And I'll say this once. It is what our people call Yi. They are witches who have chosen to embrace darkness, capable of taking the form of animals to harm others." "Why didn't you tell us before?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. "Because speaking of them can draw their attention," Grandma said softly. "We did not want to scare you, but we also hoped you would respect our warnings." Our parents performed a cleansing ceremony that afternoon. Sage smoke filled the house as they chanted prayers for protection. The atmosphere was solemn, but I felt a weight finally lifting off my shoulders. We were grounded for the rest of the stay, which was fine by me. None of us had any desire or plans to venture into those woods again, at least not for a long time. That night, I found myself staring out the window, scared but also wondering if I would see those eyes again, peering back at me. On my last day, Grandpa sat with me on the porch. "You've learned a hard lesson," he said gently. "I'm sorry we disobeyed," I apologized. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "The spirits of these lands are powerful. Some are good, others are not. So it's important to respect them and the wisdom passed down through generations." "Do you think it'll come back?" He gazed out at the tree line. "I believe the ceremony has offered protection. But remember, curiosity can be dangerous. Always trust the guidance of your elders." As I returned to the city, the experience stayed with me. It's something I still think about often, especially at night when the shadows seem a little deeper. I've become more interested in our traditions and stories, realizing they're not just tales, they're lessons. I haven't told too many people about that night. Most don't believe me when I do. But I wanted to share it here, not to scare you per se, just to remind you to respect the unknown and to listen to the people that came before us. They figured some things out long before we did, so we wouldn't have to figure them out ourselves. Funny how we naturally don't want to listen. Some things in this world can't easily be explained, and perhaps they shouldn't be. All I know is that I'll never forget those haunting whispers in the dark and the lessons we learned the hard way. Black-Eyed Kids in the Woods. From Big Red. I've been debating whether or not to share this, but it's been weighing on my mind, and maybe putting it out there will help me process what happened. This isn't some spooky campfire tale. It's something that actually occurred just a few months ago. I'm from Columbus, Ohio. My two best friends are Tyler and Greg. We've been tight since high school, played football together, went to the same college, the whole deal. Back in April, Greg's dad passed away suddenly. It was a heart attack that came out of nowhere. No warning, nothing. Greg was devastated. His dad was his rock, and losing him hit Greg harder than anything I'd ever seen. After the funeral, he was in a dark place. Tyler and I tried everything to help him out, but nothing seemed to lift his spirits. One evening, out of the blue, Greg called us up. He suggested we all go on a camping trip like we used to. He said he needed to get out of the city and clear his head. Tyler and I were all for it. Some time in nature might be just what he needed. We decided to head to Wayne National Forest in southeastern Ohio. It's a massive area with dense woods and not too many people, a perfect spot to get away. Tyler had recently bought a small RV camper. It wasn't luxurious, but it had the basics. A couple of bunks, a tiny kitchen area, and, best of all, a heater for those chilly nights. We packed up on a Friday afternoon, sleeping bags, hiking gear, a cooler full of food and drinks, then hit the road. The drive was filled with our usual joking around, though Greg was quieter than usual. We didn't push him, we just let him be. When we got to the forest, we decided to find a spot off the main trails. We wanted seclusion, a place where we could relax without other campers nearby. After navigating some narrow dirt roads, we found a clearing surrounded by tall pines. It felt right, so we set up camp, started a fire, and spent the evening grilling burgers and reminiscing. The sky was clear, and the stars were out in full force. Tyler, who's always been into astronomy, was thrilled. "Look at that sky," he said, lying back on a log. "You don't get views like this in the city." "Yeah, it's pretty amazing," I agreed. Greg seemed to relax a bit, sipping his beer and even cracking a smile now and then. It was good to see him loosen up. Around midnight, Tyler had an idea. "I'm going to sleep on the roof of the camper tonight," he announced. "I don't want to miss any of this." Greg chuckled. "You're nuts, man." "Maybe," Tyler grinned, "but I'll have the best view." I laughed. "Just don't roll off in your sleep." He grabbed a sleeping bag and climbed up, settling in on the flat roof. Greg and I decided to turn in and headed inside the camper. It was cozy, 2 small bunks and just enough room to stand up. I climbed into my bunk and pulled out my phone, scrolling through social media. Greg was lying across from me, staring at the ceiling. "You doing okay?" I asked. He sighed. "Yeah, just thinking." "About your dad?" "Yeah, he would have loved this." I nodded. "He was a good man." "Thanks," Greg said softly. We fell into silence, and eventually I started to drift off. Sometime later, I woke up to a soft knocking sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, a gentle tap at the camper door. Greg, you hear that?" I whispered. He stirred. "Hear what?" "Someone's knocking." We both listened. There it was again, a faint, deliberate knock. "Maybe it's Tyler messing with us," Greg suggested. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tyler. "Are you guys awake?" it read. "Yes," I replied. "Are you knocking on the door?" "Nope, but I see someone outside." My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "Looks like 2 kids standing near the fire pit." I showed the text to Greg. He looked as puzzled as I felt. "What are kids doing out here at this hour?" he asked. "No idea," I said. "Should we check it out?" He nodded. "Well, we can't just ignore them." I called out through the door. Hello? Can we help you?" A small voice replied, "Please, we need to use your phone." Something about the voice felt off to me. It was flat, almost mechanical. Where are your parents?" Greg asked. "Please, let us in," the voice said again. I felt a creeping sensation in my gut. We can call someone for you," I offered. "Just tell us the number." Silence. Then, "We need to come in. Let us in." My phone buzzed again. Tyler had sent another message. "Don't let them in. Something isn't right." "What's going on?" I typed back. "Their eyes, they look completely black." I felt a chill run down my spine and showed the message to Greg. "What does that even mean?" he whispered. "I don't know, but Tyler seems serious." The knocking grew louder. "Let us in," the voices demanded. They sounded more forceful than before. "Look, we can get you some help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, you need to invite us in," the voice insisted. "Why do you need an invitation?" Greg asked. "Please, we just want to come in," the voice said, almost pleading now. My phone buzzed again. Tyler wrote, "They're acting weird. They keep looking up here, but I don't think they can see me." "Should we call the police?" I texted back. Maybe, but we're pretty far out, he replied. Greg was starting to look uneasy. What do we do? I think we should just keep the door locked, I said firmly. The knocking stopped for a moment. Everything went silent. Then we heard footsteps circling the camper, slow and deliberate. They're walking around, Greg whispered. We stayed quiet, listening to the soft crunching of leaves underfoot. The footsteps stopped near one of the windows. Please, let us in, the voice said again, right outside. I peered through the curtain but couldn't see much, just a small figure standing close to the window. Why won't you let us in? The voice asked, sounding desperate. I didn't know what to reply. My mind was reeling. Then, from above, we heard a soft thump. Tyler texted, "Oh my God, they're trying to climb up here." Be careful, I typed back. He responded. One of them said something weird. I swear it sounded like, "Your friends won't help you." I showed the message to Greg. "This is getting creepy," he said. "Agreed," I replied. "Maybe we need to regroup." Good idea. We decided to bring Tyler inside. I mustered up some courage and opened the door just enough to stick my head out. "Tyler," I whispered loudly, "get down here." He carefully climbed down the ladder on the side of the camper. As he reached the ground, we heard one of the voices. "Now you've made a mistake." We quickly got inside and locked the door behind us. "What the heck is going on?" Greg asked. "I don't know," Tyler said, catching his breath. "But those kids, their eyes are pitch black. No whites, no iris, nothing." "That's impossible," I said. "Well, I saw it," he insisted. We sat there, the three of us, trying to make sense of the situation. "Maybe they're wearing contacts," Greg suggested. "At this hour? In the middle of nowhere?" Tyler replied. "Just for some prank?" My phone buzzed again. An unknown number. The message read, "You cannot hide from us." I showed it to the others. "Did you guys give your numbers out?" They shook their heads. "How did they get your number?" Greg asked. "I have no idea." The footsteps started again, this time more rapidly, circling the camper. "This is messed up," Tyler said. "We should call the police, right?" Greg asked. I tried to dial 911, but somehow the call wouldn't connect. It didn't make sense. No signal, I guess. I stared at my phone. "Same here," Tyler said, checking his. "Great," Greg muttered. The voices came again, sounding more irritated this time. "This is your last chance. Let us in." "Ignore them," I whispered. We huddled together, hoping they would just go away. Minutes felt like hours as we sat there in silence. Then everything went quiet. The footsteps, the voices, they were gone. "Do you think they left?" Greg wondered. "Maybe," Tyler said skeptically. I peered out the window but didn't see anybody. "Let's just wait a bit to be sure," I suggested. We stayed put for another half hour, and when there were no further sounds, we started to relax slightly. "Maybe it was just some kind of prank," Greg said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Who would go to that length?" Tyler asked. "Kids from town? I don't know." "Well, I'm not staying to find out," I said. "Let's pack it up and get out of here." We quickly gathered our things, trying to make as little noise as possible. As we stepped outside, the forest was eerily still. The fire had died down to glowing embers. We loaded up the camper, and just as we were about to get in, I heard it. "Do you think you're leaving?" One of those voices called out from somewhere in the dark. I spun around, but I didn't see anyone. "Who's out here?" I shouted, my voice betraying my nerves. "Silence. Let's go," Tyler urged. We jumped into the camper, and Greg started the engine. As we pulled away, the headlights briefly illuminated two figures standing at the edge of the clearing. They looked like kids, but their faces were obscured by shadows. "Did you see that?" Greg gasped, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Just drive," I said. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station about 30 miles away. It was brightly lit and felt like a sanctuary compared to the darkness we had just left. Inside, we grabbed coffees and sat down at a booth. "What the heck just happened to us, guys?" Greg asked, his hands shaking. "No idea," Tyler replied. "But those kids, whatever they actually were not normal." I pulled out my phone and did some searching for anything that might explain it. I stumbled upon loads of stories about black-eyed children, accounts eerily similar to ours. "Guys, look at this," I said, showing them my phone. We read through several stories together, Stories of people encountering children with completely black eyes, children who insisted on being let inside homes or vehicles. This can't be a real thing, Greg said. I know what you're feeling, but we just experienced this, Tyler said. We sat there for a while, processing everything. Eventually, we decided to head back home. Over the next few days, we kept in close contact, sharing any strange occurrences. Fortunately, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Greg started attending grief counseling and seemed to be coping better. Sounds crazy, he told me one day, but maybe facing something unexplainable made me realize I can't control everything. I'm glad you're doing better, I told him. Me too, but let's avoid any more camping trips for a while. Agreed, I laughed. Life started to return to normal. I haven't received any more strange texts, and neither have Greg or Tyler. I'm praying this was a one-time thing. Maybe we'll never fully understand what happened that night. But if you ever find yourself alone somewhere and someone knocks at the door begging to be let in, be doubly sure about what you do next. Stay safe out there. It was early October, and the woods outside of Denver, Colorado were beginning to show the first signs of autumn. The air had that crisp, cool edge to it, and the leaves were turning yellow and orange, creating a colorful quilt on the ground. I had decided to take a weekend trip into the woods just to get away from everything. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the open trail. I had done this 100 times before, always on my own. There was something about the solitude of camping that felt comforting to me. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon after a long drive down winding dirt roads. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as I set up my tent. The area was remote, with only a few scattered campsites nearby, but it wasn't crowded at all. I liked that. It was just the way I preferred it, quiet and isolated. By the time my tent was up, the sun had almost set. I decided to light a small campfire, knowing it would get chilly once the night fell. As I sat by the fire, poking at the embers, the sound of the woods settled in around me, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as a breeze picked up, and the soft crackle of the fire. It was peaceful, like a lullaby from nature itself. I had planned to cook some dinner, but I wasn't very hungry. Instead, I just sat there watching the flames dance, letting my mind wander. There was no particular reason I'd chosen this spot other than that it felt right. But as the night wore on, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It was subtle at first, a flicker of discomfort that I couldn't place. Maybe it was just being alone in the wilderness, but something felt off. As I sat there, the night deepened, and the forest seemed to grow quieter, more still. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard something. It wasn't an animal. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the sounds of wildlife, but this was different. It was the faintest shuffle, almost like footsteps in the leaves. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal, but the sound kept coming, growing steadily closer. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease that crept up my spine. I looked around the campsite, but everything seemed normal. The fire flickered, and the shadows in the trees seemed still. But the footsteps continued, soft and measured, as if whoever or whatever was out there was moving carefully. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My breath came a little faster now, but I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was another camper or a ranger. It wasn't uncommon for people to hike through these woods, and I could have easily missed a group setting up their own campsite nearby. Still, something about the footsteps unsettled me. The rhythm was off. It wasn't the uneven, stumbling gait of an animal. It was deliberate, too controlled, and it was too quiet. If it were an animal, I would have heard twigs snap or leaves rustle louder. The footsteps stopped. I waited for a long moment, listening intently, but the woods were silent again. My heart was pounding now, and I debated calling out, but something stopped me. I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Instead, I reached for the flashlight I had left beside me. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the campsite. But there was nothing, just the trees, the fire, and the shadows stretching long across the ground. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on me. But just as I began to relax, thinking I had imagined it, the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer. I whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but I still saw nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled and my pulse quickened. Whoever or whatever was out there was close. I could almost feel their presence, like a weight pressing against my chest. My mind raced, but my body wouldn't move. I tried to tell myself it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I was no longer alone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, barely visible in the darkness between the trees, stood still, watching me. The shape was vague at first, but as I focused, I could make out a man. He was tall, but he blended into the night so well that it was hard to see any details beyond his outline. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't know who he was, but I knew instinctively that something wasn't right. He wasn't a hiker, a camper, or a ranger. He didn't belong here. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The man didn't move, but he didn't leave either. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for me, maybe. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, but it felt like hours, and my mind was spinning. Was he a threat? Had I stumbled into someone else's territory? After what seemed like an eternity, I finally gathered the courage to speak, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? I tried, but the word came out shaky and weak. The man didn't respond. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for him to make the next move. But he didn't. He just stood there, motionless, like some sort of ghostly figure. The silence stretched out even longer, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to pack up and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man stepped back into the shadows. The footsteps I had been hearing stopped completely. The forest returned to its eerie silence. But this time, I knew something was wrong. I didn't wait around. I grabbed my gear, stuffed it into my backpack as quickly as I could, and rushed to my truck. The light from the flashlight trembled in my hand as I stumbled toward the vehicle, half expecting to see the man following me in the darkness. But when I reached my truck, there was no sign of him. I didn't stick around to see if he would show up again. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and I didn't stop until I was back in town, safe and sound. The air in the truck was thick with fear, and my heart was still pounding as I drove, every sense on high alert. I never went camping alone in those woods again. I still don't know who that man was or what his intentions were. I never saw him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when I drive through the area, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, a movement, but I never stop to look. I never want to find out if he's still there. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut pine. I'd been up in these woods for over 2 weeks now, alone with nothing but my chainsaw, an old pickup truck, and the dense forest surrounding my temporary campsite. The year was 2023, and the job was simple. Cut down a few trees, haul the logs back, and turn them into rough-cut furniture. It was the kind of work that felt honest, hard, and calming, if you could ignore the isolation. I was 31 years old, and after years of bouncing between dead-end jobs in the city, I decided to try something different. I had no family to miss me, no real friends. So when a furniture maker offered me this solitary job up in the mountains of North Carolina, I jumped at the chance. The first few days had been peaceful. I spent my days cutting wood and my nights around a small fire, trying to make sense of my life. The solitude was the perfect escape until the nights started to feel different. That evening, I finished my work early and decided to do a little extra chopping before heading back to camp. The forest was quiet, save for the steady hum of the chainsaw cutting through the thick trunks of trees. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ground. As the last rays of light disappeared, I put down the saw and looked around. The woods were suddenly much darker than they had been just moments ago. I hadn't realized how far I'd wandered from my campsite. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, thick with underbrush and the low hum of insects. I wasn't worried, though. This was my territory now. I knew the way back, or at least I thought I did. But the air felt heavier, thicker somehow, like the weight of the trees themselves was pressing down on me. I heard something then, twigs snapping in the distance. It was faint at first, just a soft crackling. I paused and listened, trying to gauge the direction. The noise was irregular, not like a deer or any other animal I knew of around here. It was too deliberate, too methodical. My hand instinctively went to the handle of the knife I kept on my belt, though I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was out there. My flashlight, which I always kept with me, was lying in the truck, not helpful now. The crackling stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear, or something smaller, maybe even a fox. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook my head and turned to head back to camp, but my foot caught on a thick root, sending me sprawling forward. My hands hit the ground, the dirt and pine needles scraping my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a second, I froze. That's when I heard it again. A low grunt, like something large and heavy moving through the forest. The sound was closer now, way too close for comfort. I felt a surge of adrenaline and scrambled to my feet, trying to listen through the pounding of my heart. The forest around me felt alive, but not in a good way. My mind was racing. Could it be another person? Maybe another camper or a lost hiker? But something about the sound felt wrong. No person would be moving through the woods like that. No person I knew anyway. I started moving faster, retracing my steps, but the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. I turned, thinking I saw something in the distance, a shadow flitting between the trees. But when I focused, nothing was there. The night was thick with uncertainty, and I was beginning to feel small, like a prey animal being stalked by something much larger. I reached the edge of a small clearing. There, in the middle of it, I saw a figure standing completely still. It wasn't very tall, but broad and thick, crouched down low, maybe even crawling before it stood up straight. I could barely make out any features in the dark, but it wasn't human. The shape was wrong. Its proportions were off, long arms and a slouch that made it seem unnaturally low to the ground. I was frozen. I couldn't think. My body was screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs were glued to the earth. Then, just like that, the figure took a step forward. I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted. Every branch I passed seemed to catch my clothes or snag my arms, but I didn't dare stop. My lungs burned as I pushed through the trees, my feet pounding the earth. I knew I had to make it back to the truck. It was my only shot. The thumping of something large running behind me was faint but unmistakable. I could hear it, feel it. Whatever it was following me. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, I was out of breath and shaking. I scrambled for my keys, fumbling as I tried to unlock the door. Every movement felt slow, too slow, like I was in some kind of nightmare. When I finally got the door open, I jumped in and slammed it shut behind me. I didn't take a second to breathe. I cranked the engine, threw the truck into gear, and sped down the rough dirt path, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't even care if I was going the right way. I just had to get out. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the trees ahead. But every now and then, I thought I saw something just off the road, a figure standing still in the shadows, watching me. I didn't stop, not for anything. I drove for what felt like hours, not slowing down until I finally reached the small town at the base of the mountain. It wasn't until I parked in a gas station lot that I finally took a moment to breathe, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dim lights of the station. The noise of the world felt like a distant echo compared to the stillness of the woods. I wanted to believe it was just some wild animal, maybe a bear or a boar. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had been something else. I wasn't sure I'd be able to return to that spot again. The forest felt like a different place now. One where something was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment. Maybe I was just spooked. Maybe it was the isolation, the constant hum of the chainsaw, the way the forest closed in around me at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in those woods wasn't done with me yet. The beast is still here. From Alice K last summer, my friend Lily and I decided to take a little trip to France. We'd both just graduated from college and wanted to do something a bit more adventurous before diving into the whole career thing. We'd saved up some cash from our part-time jobs and planned a 2-week backpacking trip through the French countryside. We started in Paris, of course, soaking in all the touristy stuff. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, the drill. But both of us were more interested in the less traveled paths, so we headed south to the rural areas, wanting to experience what we called the real France. One place that caught our attention was the region of Jodon. Lily had read about it in some historical thriller novel and was intrigued by the legends of the Beast of Jodon, a creature that supposedly terrorized the area in the 18th century. I'm a bit of a history buff myself, so I was all in. We arrived in a small village called Marouis, nestled in the mountains. It was picturesque, with cobblestone streets and old stone houses. The locals were friendly enough, but seemed a bit reserved when we mentioned our interest in the beast's legend. One elderly woman even crossed herself and muttered something under her breath when we brought it up. Undeterred, we found a quiet little inn to stay in and planned a hike through the nearby forests the next day. The innkeeper, a middle-aged man I'll call Jax, warned us to stick to the marked trails. People can get lost easily, he said in his thick accent. And wolves have been more active lately. Wolves? Lily asked, her eyes lighting up. Yes, but they usually avoid humans, he replied. Just be cautious. The next morning, our backpacks loaded with snacks and all the goods, we set off. The forest was breathtaking. Tall trees forming a canopy overhead and the smell of pine in the air. The birds chirping were a nice cherry on top. It was everything we'd hoped for, the very reason we planned this trip in the first place. About 2 hours into the hike, we came across an old, overgrown path that wasn't on our map. Lily, ever the adventurous type, thought that we should take it. "Come on, Emma," she said, tugging at my arm. "This is exactly the kind of off-the-beaten-path experience we both want." I hesitated. "I don't know. Jack said to stay on the marked trails." She rolled her eyes playfully. "Are you afraid of the beast from a few hundred years ago? Think it's going to come back and get us?" I laughed. "Fine, but if we get lost, I'm blaming you." We ventured down the path, which wound deeper into the woods. The trees were denser here, and the light filtering through the leaves gave everything a greenish hue. It was eerie, but beautiful. After about an hour, we stumbled upon a clearing with the ruins of what looked like an old stone cottage. Moss covered the walls, and nature had begun to reclaim the place. Intrigued, we decided to explore. "Imagine who might have lived here," Lily mused, running her hand over the rough stone as we looked around. I noticed strange markings etched into one of the remaining walls. They did not look like any writing I'd seen, more like symbols or sigils. "Hey, check this out," I called to Lily. She walked over, squinting at the markings. "Weird. Maybe it's some kind of old language." That moment, a strange rustling sound came from the trees behind us. We both froze. Eventually, I whispered, "Maybe just an animal." "Maybe," Lily suggested, her earlier bravado now fading. "Yeah, good idea." As we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees, a large, dark shape that seemed to be too big to be a deer. "Did you see that?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "See what?" "I don't know. I saw something move over there." We stood still, together scanning the forest. The woods had gone unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Come on, let's go," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. We started back the way we came, walking quickly but trying not to panic. Every so often, I'd hear the crack of a twig or the rustle of leaves, and I would glance back to see nothing. After what felt like ages, we realized we weren't on the same path that we'd taken earlier. Are we lost? I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The path should be right here, Lily insisted, looking around frantically. We pulled out the map, but it was useless. We had no idea where we were, and better yet, our phones had no signal, and the GPS wasn't working well under the thick canopy. Okay, let's stay calm, I said. We can retrace our steps. Just then, a low growl came through the trees. This time, we both heard it. I remember Lily joking, asking if that was my stomach, but she sounded terrified. We started to move faster, the growling growing louder and closer. Suddenly, Lily screamed, and I spun around to see this massive animal emerge from the shadows. It looked like a wolf, but far too large, with matted fur and glowing yellow eyes. Its snout was longer than a wolf's too, and saliva dripped from its bared fangs. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted through the trees, branches whipping against our faces. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Out of nowhere, Lily tripped over a root and went sprawling. I skidded to a halt and rushed back to help her up. "Come on," I urged, pulling her to her feet. "That thing is closing in on us." In blind panic, we veered off to the left, spotting a rocky incline ahead. We scrambled up the rocks, hoping the creature couldn't follow us. Reaching the top, we found ourselves on another trail, a real one this time, with signs and markers. Relief washed over me. "Look!" I pointed to a sign indicating the way back to the village. But before we could celebrate, the beast appeared at the bottom of the incline, staring up at us with those malevolent eyes. It let out a howl that echoed through the mountains. "Go!" Lily yelled. We raced down the trail, the creature now out of sight, but the fear propelling us forward. After running nonstop for what felt like miles, we burst out of the forest and fell onto a road where a small van was parked. An older man was loading crates into the back. He looked up, startled to see two disheveled girls sprinting toward him. "Please help us," I gasped. He took one look at us and gestured for us to get into the van. Without hesitation, we jumped in and he sped off toward the village. "What happened?" he asked in broken English. Some kind of animal chased us," Lily explained between breaths. He nodded grimly. "The beast." "You know about it?" I asked. He didn't answer me, but that alone was answer enough. Back in Marui's, we went straight to the inn. Jack took one look at us and shook his head. "You went off the trails, didn't you?" he said, not unkindly. "We're sorry," I apologized, "but we saw something out there, something that shouldn't exist." Jack sighed. "Zond is not just a story. Many here have seen it. Why doesn't anyone do something about it?" Lily demanded. He shrugged. "What can we do? It's a curse that has plagued this region for centuries." That night, we stayed in our room, doors locked and windows shuttered. Neither of us slept much. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short and head back to Paris. As we were leaving, Jack handed us a small pendant with an intricate design. "What's this?" I asked. "A protective charm for your safety." We thanked him and left, eager to put distance between us and whatever lurked in those woods. Back in Paris, amidst the bustle of the city, the whole experience felt surreal. But the nightmares that followed reminded me that it was, in fact, real. I still have dreams, on occasion, of those yellow eyes and that haunting growl. Lily and I don't talk about it much. When people do ask about our trip, we stick to the highlights, the Eiffel Tower, the cafes, the art museums. No one would believe our encounter anyway. But I do wonder now, what else is out there in the hidden corners of the world? What other things exist that people simply are too afraid to talk about? And I still can't shake the feeling that we were lucky enough to make it out of Jodon alive. I've always enjoyed the quiet solitude of camping. There's something calming about being in the middle of nowhere. Just you, the forest, and the hum of nature. My last trip was no different. It was late September, the weather cool but not too chilly, the leaves still holding on to their autumn colors. I had picked a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest trail, far from any busy campsites. The kind of place you go to get away from it all. I was by myself, as usual. I'd been camping alone for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. It was a way for me to recharge. to clear my head. I found a small flat area surrounded by trees and set up my tent. The site was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the chirping of birds in the distance. That evening, after a simple dinner of canned chili and crackers, I settled in by the campfire. I brought a book, but I didn't feel like reading. Instead, I just stared into the flames, lost in thought. It was peaceful out here, but as the night wore on, something felt off. It was hard to describe, like the air itself had grown heavier. Or maybe it was just the quiet. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects or the occasional sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was too still. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the fire started to die down, I felt an odd urge to get up and walk around. There was no reason for it, really. I just had this need to move. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and stepped out of the warmth of the firelight into the cold, dark woods. I stayed within sight of my campsite at first, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the ground and the trees. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as I walked a little farther, my light caught something strange on the ground. It was partially hidden in the leaves and dirt, just barely visible. I crouched down to get a closer look. It was a skull. Human. My heart raced as I stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I wasn't prepared for this. I had heard of people stumbling upon animal bones in the woods, maybe even old abandoned campsites, but a human skull? That was something entirely different. It wasn't just any skull either. It was old, way old, older than I had anticipated. There were no signs of a body nearby, no trace of a burial. The skull was weathered, worn by time, the bones bleached almost white by the sun. I turned it over in my hands carefully. The jaw was partially cracked, and the teeth inside were missing or broken. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I took a step back, suddenly uneasy. I had no idea how to explain this. Was it a recent find, or had it been here for years, left untouched by time? The thought of someone dying out here in the woods alone made my stomach churn. It wasn't a comforting thought. I shone my flashlight around the area, hoping for some clue about what had happened, but there was nothing. Just trees, leaves, and the dark quiet of the forest. I decided to take the skull back to camp with me. It was morbid, but I couldn't leave it there. Something about it called to me, like a mystery that needed solving. I gently placed it in my backpack and made my way back to the fire. Once I got back, I set the skull down on the log next to my campfire, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do with it? I sat there for a while, the fire crackling in the background, the skull's empty eyes staring back at me. It was strange, almost unsettling, the kind of thing you couldn't unsee once you had. And I knew I wouldn't be able to just ignore it. As the hours passed, I found myself more and more drawn to it. I couldn't explain why. I thought about packing up and leaving, heading back to civilization, but the thought of the long drive in the dark kept me rooted to the spot. I continued to stare into the fire, the skull looming beside me. Eventually, I fell asleep in my tent, the skull still beside the fire. I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it or if it was real, but I could have sworn I heard something moving around my campsite during the night. A rustling in the leaves, something shifting in the shadows. But when I checked in the morning, everything was just as it had been the night before. The next morning, I packed up my things, still uneasy but determined to get the rest of the trip over with. I had a few more days off, but I couldn't bring myself to stay another night. I buried the skull under a pile of rocks and leaves, not sure if that was what I was supposed to do with it, but it felt like the right thing. As I left the campsite behind and drove back into town, the weight of the whole experience stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something out there in the woods, something old and forgotten. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was the skull itself. Either way, I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be camping there again. I had never been one for camping, but my buddy Alex convinced me that this weekend would be different. It was the fall of 2018, and we had planned to head out to a secluded spot in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. The area was known for being quiet and peaceful, a perfect place to unwind. Or so we thought. We arrived at the site on a Friday evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. Alex had done all the planning, from the food to the gear, so all I had to do was follow his lead. I wasn't the most outdoorsy person, but I trusted Alex. He'd been camping all his life and seemed to know everything about the wilderness. We set up our tents in a small clearing near a creek that ran through the woods. The air was cool, but not uncomfortable, and the smell of damp earth and pine trees filled my nose. Alex started a fire while I unpacked our bags. There were no other campers in sight, which I thought was odd considering the place was a popular destination for weekend getaways. But I figured it didn't matter. We'd have the whole place to ourselves. As night fell, we sat by the fire eating canned beans and chatting about life. The sound of the creek flowing nearby was soothing, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees gave the woods a sense of life. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel off. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. It wasn't any one thing. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that settled over everything like a thick blanket. I noticed that there were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, not even the usual sounds of small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just stillness. "Hey, you hear that?" I asked Alex, breaking the silence. He paused, listening intently. "No, but now that you mention it, it's dead quiet. Probably just the time of year." I shrugged, trying to brush off the unease I felt. We finished our meal, and I set about preparing for bed. The fire was beginning to burn out, leaving only a few embers glowing faintly in the dark. Alex was already in his tent, and I was about to crawl into mine when I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. My heart started to race. It was too loud to be an animal. It sounded like someone was walking through the woods, deliberately trying to make noise. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it out into the dark. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but the thick black shadows between the trunks. I waited, straining my ears for any other sound. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no more snapping branches, just the same silence as before. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, or maybe a tree branch falling. But the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. I looked over at Alex's tent. His silhouette was barely visible in the dim light, and there was no movement from inside. I considered waking him, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. After a long, uncomfortable pause, I finally crawled into my own tent, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind stir the trees, my mind running wild. Was someone out there? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? It didn't help that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and tried to sleep, but the feeling only grew stronger. The night stretched on, and I kept hearing noises, soft footsteps on the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, like someone was moving closer. Each time I shone my flashlight out, I saw nothing. At around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone whispering just outside my tent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice, not the usual sounds of the forest. I held my breath, trying to listen more closely, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. I lay completely still, not daring to move. The only sound I could hear now was the rush of the creek, far in the distance. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sounds of birds chirping. The sky was clear, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the campsite. Alex was already up, sitting by the fire and sipping from a mug. "You sleep all right?" he asked when he saw me emerge from the tent. I didn't want to seem too freaked out, so I just nodded. "Yeah, just had a weird night, I guess." Alex didn't seem to notice anything off. He was his usual laid-back self, setting up breakfast as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced around the campsite, my eyes scanning the surrounding trees and the thick underbrush that stretched out beyond our small clearing. It was too quiet. The silence from last night was still hanging in the air. We spent the morning hiking a nearby trail, but I couldn't enjoy it like I normally would. Every crack of a branch, every rustling of leaves made my heart race. I kept expecting to see someone or something lurking just out of sight. The trail was supposed to be a relaxing walk, but I was on edge the entire time. That afternoon, we decided to head back to camp and rest. I was hoping a nap would help settle my nerves, but when we returned, things only got worse. I don't know what tipped me off first. Maybe it was the way Alex's tent was slightly out of place or how the fire pit had been disturbed, the logs scattered in a way that didn't make sense. Or maybe it was the fact that the creek, which had been rushing steadily the night before, was now eerily quiet. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't. Something was wrong. We spent the rest of the day at camp, but I was constantly looking over my shoulder, my eyes darting to every movement in the trees. When night fell, the silence returned, even heavier than before. We had a campfire again, but the warmth of the flames didn't ease my nerves this time. Around midnight, when the fire had burned low, I heard the sounds again. Snap, snap, snap. Someone or something was out there, moving in the woods. I wasn't sure if Alex had heard it too, but I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I was going to check the perimeter. He didn't argue. He just sat there by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the woods, moving cautiously, listening for any other signs of movement. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I certainly wasn't prepared for what I found. A few yards away from the campsite, I found fresh footprints. Big, heavy footprints, and they weren't animal tracks. They were human. Barefoot, but unmistakably human. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. Who else would be out here? There was no one else at the campground when we arrived, and we hadn't seen a soul since. I followed the tracks for a while, my heart pounding in my chest. But then I stopped, realizing something that made my blood run cold. The tracks led nowhere. They stopped suddenly, as if the person had simply vanished. I turned around quickly, my stomach in knots. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I needed to get back to camp. When I returned, Alex was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. His tent was empty, the fire was dying, and the place felt completely abandoned. Panic set in. I called out for him, but my voice echoed into the dark woods, swallowed by the vast silence. I didn't wait long. I grabbed my gear and ran. Whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking us, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I don't know how I made it out of those woods that night. My legs were shaking, and my heart felt like it might explode. But I kept running, pushing through the underbrush, knowing I needed to get to safety. By the time I reached the road, the sun was beginning to rise. My phone had no service, and I couldn't even remember the way back to town. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that place. It took hours before I finally stumbled upon a small gas station, and from there, I managed to hitch a ride back to the nearest town. I never went back to that campsite, and I never heard from Alex again. The police searched the area, but they never found any trace of him. They said he must have wandered off, but I know better. Something or someone was out there, watching us. And whatever it wasn't done with me yet. I wasn't expecting much when I decided to go camping. I just needed some time away from everything. The endless noise of the city, the constant work, the stress. I figured a weekend in the middle of nowhere would do me good. No people, no obligations, just me and the stars. At first, I had planned on going with some friends, but they all bailed. I didn't want to back out, so I went alone. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot, park my RV, set up camp, and just be. I found this campsite just off some back roads in Texas. It was far enough away from the nearest town to feel isolated, but not so far that it was dangerous. I figured I'd be fine. The worst that could happen was I'd get a little bored, right? I showed up, set up my RV, and got a small fire going. Nothing crazy, just a few logs to keep warm. I had brought a cooler with some food, a couple of beers, and some books to read. As the night crept in, everything started to feel calm, too calm almost. The trees were dead still, the wind barely moved, the kind of silence that feels unnatural after a while. But I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just getting paranoid. It's easy to do when you're alone. I spent the evening just relaxing. I ate a simple meal, nothing fancy, grilled a few sausages, had some chips. I opened a beer and stared into the fire, watching the flames flicker. I remember feeling weirdly calm, despite how silent everything was. But then, around midnight, the silence started to feel oppressive, almost like I was waiting for something to happen. I kept hearing sounds in the distance, something snapping in the trees, but every time I turned around, nothing was there. A raccoon? A deer? Something small? I kept telling myself it was nothing. By around 1 a.m., I was exhausted. I shut everything down, locked the RV, and crawled into bed. I remember thinking as I lay there, this is nice. Too quiet, but nice. My eyes closed, and I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up with a headache so intense it felt like someone had been drilling into my skull all night. It took me a second to focus on what was going on. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the fog out of my head, but it wasn't helping. Then I noticed it. The RV door was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't opened it. I'd locked it before going to bed. I was sure of it. But there it was, the door standing wide open, the cool night air rushing in, the dim light from the campfire casting long shadows into the RV. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps, no voices. The world outside was still. It was as if the entire campground was holding its breath. But the headache, it was like nothing I'd ever felt before. I could barely think straight. I sat up in bed, my legs feeling like jelly, my mind scrambling. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I'd just forgotten to lock the door. But the deeper I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't right. I stumbled out of bed, dizziness hitting me in waves. The air inside the RV felt heavier than normal, like it had been closed up for too long. I moved toward the door, trying to shake off the dizziness. When I reached the door, I looked outside. The campground was still empty, the fire burning low. The RV's steps creaked under my weight as I took a step out onto the dirt. Everything seemed normal at first, but I felt like I was missing something important. I looked back at the RV, and that's when it hit me. I didn't remember the door opening, not once, not even a crack, and I definitely didn't leave it open. I went back inside, heart hammering. I checked everything. My wallet was missing. I was sure I'd left it on the counter next to the sink, but now it was gone. I checked the windows. They were all shut tight, the curtains still drawn. No one had broken in through the windows, but that still didn't explain the door. I started to feel like I was going insane. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had been here while I slept. Maybe they had opened the door after I was knocked out. Knocked out. That's when I remembered the headache. I hadn't just woken up with a headache. It was like someone had drugged me, a sharp, foggy feeling in my brain that wasn't just from sleep. It felt chemical. Something was wrong. I ran my hand along the vent above my head. The air was warm. A terrible thought struck me. What if someone had pumped something into the RV to knock me out? I started checking every vent in the RV, touching them one by one, feeling the warmth seep through. It hit me that I'd never paid much attention to the ventilation before. There were no signs of a break-in, no marks on the door, no smashed windows. But what if someone had been inside, watching me while I slept? What if they'd opened the door after I was drugged? I walked around the RV again, my mind racing. My legs felt shaky, like I hadn't eaten in days, like I was about to pass out. But something was making my blood run cold, the feeling that I wasn't alone, the sensation that someone had been here. And it wasn't just the open door. That's when I found the small bag under the bed. At first, I thought it was mine, just some gear I'd forgotten about. But when I opened it, I froze. Inside were items I didn't recognize. Gloves, rope, a flashlight, a small knife, a bag that looked like it could fit a person's head in it. It was all too planned. This wasn't just a robbery. Someone had been preparing for something worse. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. I wasn't safe here. Whoever had been in my RV could still be nearby, watching. I grabbed my phone. No signal. Panic surged through me. I needed to get out. I ran to the RV's engine, praying it would start, but it sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. Whoever had been here had tampered with it. My legs felt weak, but I knew I had no choice. I had to run. I bolted out the door into the cold night with no clear direct, just away from the RV. My body was sluggish, my brain foggy from whatever they drugged me with, but I couldn't stop. I heard footsteps behind me, too quiet to pinpoint, but they were there. I could feel them. Whoever it was following me. I kept running, my heart pounding, sweat trickling down my forehead despite the chill. I had no idea how far I'd gone, or if I was even heading in the right direction. But then I saw headlights. A truck. I waved my arms like a maniac, and thank God they stopped. The driver helped me into the truck, and I was barely able to speak, my head still throbbing with that unrelenting pain. I tried to tell him what happened, but it was all jumbled. He just listened. Confused, but kind enough to take me to the nearest town. The police took my statement, but they didn't believe me. They said I was probably just disoriented, that I had overreacted to a simple break-in. They didn't find anything near the RV, no signs of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. I don't go camping alone anymore. The road into the Adirondacks was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark green needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed, complete isolation. No people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I'd been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine. Gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured, probably a bored hiker from weeks ago. But as I moved through the forest gathering wood, I found more of them. Carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about, just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved. Tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But after a long moment, the rustling stopped, the trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere, slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning. Endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake. Trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Alder Andax, it's different." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once, and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. "Local ghost stories." The man didn't smile. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right and something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it." He turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he'd looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening, back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For hours, I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move. But it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite. The same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the area, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still out there, somewhere in those woods. It was still watching, and maybe it always would be. I pulled the RV off the narrow, dusty road and into the shadow of Dead Man's Gulch. The engine sputtered to a stop, and for a moment I sat there in silence, staring out at the barren valley stretching before me. The Ruby Mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and dark against the fading light. This was exactly what I wanted: isolation, quiet, and a place where the world couldn't find me. The RV had become my escape after Laura died. I could roam wherever I wanted, park wherever I pleased, and it felt like a kind of freedom. But now, sitting here in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The place had a weight to it, like the air was thick with something unseen, something waiting. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, the dry desert air biting at my skin as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Dead Man's Gulch was as desolate as it sounded. I had read about it in a ghost stories book I found at a thrift store. Some legend about miners who disappeared back in the late 1800s. They supposedly saw shadowy figures in the valley at night before the earth collapsed and swallowed them whole. I didn't believe in ghosts, cryptids, or any of the nonsense locals spouted about this place. I just wanted to be alone, away from the pitying glances and endless condolences. No one understood how grief gnawed at you, hollowing you out until nothing was left. Setting up camp took about 15 minutes. I parked the RV next to the remnants of an old mining camp, a few rusted-out carts, the skeletal remains of a cabin, and a collapsed mine shaft disappearing into the hillside. It was perfect. No people, no distractions, just me, the desert, and the stars. By the time I finished dinner, canned chili, nothing fancy, the sun had dipped below the horizon. I sat at the small table inside the RV, staring at the book in front of me, filled with old tales of ghost sightings and strange disappearances, most of them from around here. The locals called it the Phantom of the Mines, a shadowy creature that haunted the valleys, stalking anyone who got too close to the abandoned shafts. I flipped through the pages, skimming over accounts of miners swearing they'd seen something dark moving in the fog just before disaster struck. I shook my head and closed the book. Ghosts, shadows. It was all nonsense. Laura would have laughed at the idea. She'd never been scared of anything. Not the woods, not the wild. She was fearless. But I wasn't Laura. As I cleaned up, the RV's lights flickered. I paused, glancing at the ceiling. The lights steadied again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just a glitch, I told myself. The RV was old. Things broke. But the air suddenly felt colder. When I glanced out the window, I swore I saw movement, something shifting in the darkness just beyond the headlights. I stepped outside, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The night was still. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses down on you. I scanned the area, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing moved. Just rocks, dirt, and the skeletal remains of the old mining camp. Then I heard it. Faint. Like the sound of gravel shifting underfoot, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Jake," I muttered. "It's just the wind." I turned back toward the RV, ready to call it a night, until I saw them. Handprints. Long streaks of dust trailing down the windows, as if someone or something had dragged their fingers across the glass. My heart skipped a beat. I was alone. I knew that. No one had passed me on the road for hours. No one was out here. At least, no one should have been. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The RV felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the wind outside picked up, howling through the narrow canyon. I sat at the table, staring at the window, waiting, but nothing happened. The next morning, the RV was completely dead. No power, no lights, no water pump, nothing. I checked the battery. It was completely drained. It didn't make sense. I had it checked before I left. It was supposed to last for weeks. Frustrated, I spent most of the day trying to figure out what was wrong, but everything seemed fine. The battery had just died. By late afternoon, I gave up. I was stuck here for the night. I cursed under my breath. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just bad luck. I decided to go for a walk, maybe clear my head. The old mine shaft loomed in the distance, and I made my way toward it. The ground was hard and cracked, littered with strange deep marks crisscrossing the dirt. They looked like they'd been dragged by something large. Too large. At the mine's entrance, the air was cooler, thick with the smell of dust and rot. The opening had collapsed years ago, the rocks jagged and sharp. But there, in the dirt, were more of those strange marks, long, deep gouges, like something had been clawing its way out. I backed away, chest tightening. It was just a mine, just old rocks and dirt. But as I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving at the edge of the rocks. I whipped around, nothing. I ran back to the RV, heart pounding. That night, the first knock came just after midnight, a loud, deliberate bang on the side of the RV. I shot up, grabbing the shotgun by my bed. My hands shook as I loaded it. Another bang, closer this time. "Who's there?" I shouted, voice cracking. No answer, just the sound of gravel shifting. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the door. The cold hit me hard. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. No one. But then I saw it. A dark, shifting figure at the edge of the rocks. Its form flickered like smoke in the wind. It didn't have a face, but I felt its eyes on me. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed, but the thing didn't move. It just faded. I stumbled back inside, locking the door. The lights flickered and then went dark. I sat in total blackness, shotgun in my lap, waiting. But it didn't come back. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up and climbed into the driver's seat. Miraculously, the RV started like nothing had been wrong. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, speeding away from Dead Man's Gulch. The weight in the air lifted, the fog was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling I had narrowly escaped something dark, something still waiting in those mines. And as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, just in case. My name's Ronald Lopez, and this happened back in 1996 in the thick pine stretches of Idaho's Payette National Forest. Now, I'm not some storytelling type, but when you've seen what I've seen, it sits with you whether you want it to or not. I've been with the Forest Service nearly a decade, mostly search and rescue, but I don't really get a thrill out of finding folks lost off the trails. It's just a job, you know? Pays the bills and keeps my folks from worrying too much. But this wasn't a typical day at work. The call came in just past noon. 2 teenagers had gone missing around Lake Cascade while hiking, and their mom swore up and down that they wouldn't have wandered off the marked trails. Typical, I thought. Parents always claim their kids are not the type to take risks, and they end up climbing a cliffside or venturing miles off the paths. I radioed in, grabbed my pack, and met up with my buddy Matt Taylor at the ranger station. We'd handled plenty of search missions together, so we had our system down pat. By the time we started the hike, the sun was a half-hearted glow behind thick clouds, casting a dim grayness over the woods. We headed up the main trail, our boots crunching over the underbrush and fallen pine needles. I remember making some wisecrack about the kids probably sitting by the lake with no cell signal, blissfully unaware of the mini panic they'd sparked. Matt chuckled and responded with something about making up for our overtime with the stash of cold beers back at the station. Just another day on the job, so I thought. It wasn't long before we hit signs of trouble. About a mile up, we found what looked like a small campsite. A few scattered granola bar wrappers, a disposable camera, and a dirty sweatshirt lying next to a patch of trampled ferns. But there was something off about the setup. It didn't feel like kids were lounging around here. It felt more like someone had run through. The air was heavy, and I could smell this rank, earthy stench that was wrong for the forest. Matt raised an eyebrow at me, like he was feeling it too. We called out a few times, half expecting the teens to stumble out of the bushes, embarrassed and red-faced, but nothing stirred except a few startled birds in that eerie silence that fills the gaps where sounds should be. I knelt down, trying to get a sense of what had gone down here. There was a sharp imprint in the dirt, something like a claw mark, but wider and deeper than any animal I'd seen in these woods. I brushed my fingers over it, feeling the jagged lines. Whatever made that wasn't anything natural. "You seeing this?" I asked. Matt had spotted something farther up, a chunk of what looked like torn fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It was a piece of a t-shirt, stained dark, likely blood. I felt a chill settle over me then, a realization that whatever was out here wasn't just a wild animal. We both knew when to trust our gut, and my gut was screaming that we were in over our heads. We pressed on, calling their names, but now every rustle in the bushes had me glancing over my shoulder. About a mile deeper into the woods, we found the first body. It was one of the teens, a boy, face down with his arm twisted under him at an unnatural angle. His body was mangled in a way that no mountain lion or bear would have done. His torso was scratched open, not by claws, but by something else, something that seemed to tear rather than slash. Matt stepped back, a grimace on his face, muttering something I didn't quite catch. We checked for signs of life, even though it was obvious we'd be wasting our time. He was gone. Worse yet, the terror etched onto his face told us this was no accident, no animal mishap. It was a hunt. We radioed back to the station, giving as calm a report as we could manage. They told us to stay put. Backup was on the way. But Matt and I exchanged a look. Sitting still in the woods with God knows what lurking around? Not likely. We agreed to find higher ground and keep watch until help arrived, but something told me that wouldn't be enough. Just as we started back toward a nearby ridge, we heard a faint sound, a low, uneven clicking, like stones scraping together. It was rhythmic and unnatural, like it had intent behind it. Matt raised his flashlight, sweeping it in a wide arc. I followed his beam, and for a moment we saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, between two thick pines, a shape appeared. It was unlike anything I'd seen, like a mix between a lizard and something much larger. It moved low to the ground, with a long, scaly body and limbs that looked almost human in shape, though bent and twisted in a way that no human could ever walk. Its skin was dark and rough, patched with what looked like scales. But the strangest part was its head, elongated with a wide, flat mouth and jagged rows of what I can only describe as crocodile-like teeth. Matt and I froze. The thing paused, raising its head as if it sensed us. Then, with a sharp hiss, it lunged forward. I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over, and I yanked Matt to the side just as it shot past us, swiping the air with a clawed arm. We bolted up the ridge, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste. But it was on us, relentless, snapping its jaws and thrashing the underbrush with every step. I remember yelling at Matt to split off, hoping to confuse it or at least buy us some time. He hesitated, but the look on my face must have convinced him, and he veered off to the left. I dove to the right, dodging trees and scrambling up a small incline. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, tearing at anything in its path. There was no mercy, no pause. It was like it had locked onto us, hungry and unyielding. I lost track of Matt in the chaos, my mind racing as I looked for any place to hide. I spotted a small crevice between two rocks and dove in, pressing myself flat against the earth, hoping it would lose my scent. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of Matt's scream cutting through the forest. It was short, choked off, and I knew he'd met the same fate as the teenager back at the campsite. The clicking sound grew fainter, and I dared to lift my head. My legs were numb, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. But the forest around me was silent again. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, watching the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. When I was sure it was safe, I crawled out, my legs unsteady, and started the long trek back to the station alone. When I returned to the ranger station, the backup was just arriving. They looked at me like I'd gone mad when I tried to explain what happened. They asked about Matt, and I told them the truth, as much as they would believe. We went back out to search, but we only found remnants, torn pieces of clothing, broken branches, and drag marks leading deeper into the forest. No sign of Matt, no bodies, nothing to prove what we'd seen except my own word. Months later, I did some digging, trying to find any hint of what that creature was. Local legend spoke of a predator, something that roamed these woods centuries ago, rumored to be a guardian or a curse, depending on who you asked. They called it the Leshy, a name whispered by those who claimed to have seen it before vanishing into the wilderness. They said it only showed itself to those who dared to encroach on its territory too far, too boldly, as if it needed to remind us that we were still trespassers here. That creature, it wasn't just hunting, it was sending a message loud and clear. My name is Brian Patel, and back in 2016, I found myself deep in the heart of Montana's Glacier National Park. I'd always been an outdoor enthusiast, spending my weekends hiking trails and exploring the wilderness. That summer, my buddy Trevor and I decided to tackle the Highline Trail, a 15-mile trek known for its stunning vistas and challenging terrain. We arrived at the park early in the morning, the sun just beginning to cast a warm glow over the rugged mountains. Trevor cracked a joke about us being the next Granite Grizzlies, a nickname we'd given ourselves after one too many camping trips. I laughed, adjusting my backpack. If we see any actual grizzlies, you can be the one to hug them, I shot back. As we set off, the trail was everything we hoped for, towering cliffs on one side and sheer drops on the other. We passed a few fellow hikers, sharing nods and smiles. One older gentleman warned us about loose rocks ahead. "Thanks for the heads up," Trevor replied. "We'll make sure not to lose our footing. Gravity's got enough victims already." About 5 miles in, we reached a fork in the path. The main trail continued forward, but a narrower, less trodden path veered off to the left. A weathered sign pointed left, labeled Swift Creek Overlook. Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Feel like taking the road less traveled?" "Why not?" I shrugged. "Could be an adventure. Besides, maybe we'll find that pot of gold everyone's always talking about." We turned onto the smaller trail, and the atmosphere subtly shifted. The sounds of distant hikers faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The canopy overhead grew denser, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. After another mile, we stumbled upon an abandoned ranger station. It was a small, rustic cabin with a collapsed porch and windows clouded by dust and time. "Looks like fixer-upper material," Trevor quipped. "Think they'd mind if we moved in?" "Sure," I said, "as long as you're okay with the wildlife roommates. Rent's probably cheap." Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a quick look inside. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying hints of mildew and aged wood. A desk sat against one wall, papers strewn across it as if someone had left in a hurry. Trevor picked up a faded photograph from the desk. It showed a group of rangers posing proudly in front of the very cabin we stood in. "Wonder what happened here," he mused. "Maybe they got tired of the decor," I suggested. "Or perhaps the commute was killer." As we left the cabin, I noticed something odd. A series of deep scratches gouged into the wooden exterior, almost like claw marks. I pointed them out to Trevor. "Think we've got a big cat around?" He examined the marks. "Could be. Mountain lions are known to roam these parts. Adds a little excitement, don't you think?" "Just what I needed," I said. "A reason to keep my head on a swivel." We continued along the trail, which grew narrower and more overgrown. The underbrush thickened, and the sounds of wildlife became more pronounced. Birds chirped intermittently, and the distant call of an unknown animal echoed through the trees. "Ever feel like you're being watched?" Trevor asked, only half joking. "All the time. It's my natural charisma," I replied with a smirk. We reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a breathtaking view of a waterfall, cascading into a crystalline pool below. "Now that's worth the hike," I said. Trevor was about to respond when he froze, his eyes fixed on something across the clearing. "Did you see that?" "See what?" I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. "I thought I saw movement, something big." "Maybe it's your ego manifesting physically," I teased. He chuckled nervously. "Yeah, maybe." We decided to take a short break, sitting on a fallen log and munching on trail mix. I pulled out my map to check our location. "According to this, the Swift Creek overlook should be just ahead." "Great," Trevor said. "I can't wait to update my social media with some envy-inducing photos." As we packed up to leave, a sudden rustling in the bushes behind us made us both turn sharply. A deer burst out, darting across the clearing at breakneck speed. "Guess we're not the only ones enjoying the great outdoors," I said. But then we heard another sound, a low, guttural noise that defied easy description. It was unlike any animal call I'd ever heard. "What was that?" Trevor whispered. I shook my head. "Probably just the wind, or your stomach complaining about that gas station burrito." He didn't laugh. "Maybe we should head back." "Come on, we're almost to the overlook. Don't tell me you're scared." He hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, but let's keep moving." We pressed on, but the forest seemed to grow darker despite the still high sun. The trees towered over us, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The path was barely visible now, more of a suggestion than a trail. Another sound pierced the silence, a snapping branch, closer this time. We both stopped. "Brian, maybe we should turn around," Trevor said, his voice tense. All right. Maybe this was a bad idea," I admitted. We started back the way we came, picking up our pace. The forest, which had felt so welcoming earlier, now seemed oppressive. Every shadow looked like it was concealing something. Suddenly, Trevor tripped and fell hard. I rushed to help him up. "You okay?" "Yeah, just twisted my ankle, I think." "Can you walk?" He tested his weight. "It's not great, but I can manage." As we resumed our hurried retreat, a chilling howl echoed through the trees. It was close, too close. "That's no mountain lion," I said quietly. "Keep moving," Trevor urged. We broke into a limping jog. The path was nearly impossible to follow, and in our panic, we veered off into uncharted territory. Without warning, a massive figure burst from the foliage, blocking our path. It stood on all fours, covered in thick, matted fur. Its body was like that of a wolf, but far larger, easily the size of a bear. Saliva dripped from its maw, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted in the opposite direction, adrenaline overriding Trevor's injury. The creature let out a bone-chilling snarl and gave chase. Dodging trees and leaping over roots, we ran blindly through the forest. Behind us, the thunderous footsteps of the beast grew louder. I could hear its heavy breathing, feel the ground shake with each stride. Trevor stumbled again, and this time the creature was upon him before I could react. It swiped at him with a massive paw, sending him crashing into a tree. Blood spattered across the leaves. "Trevor!" I screamed. I looked around frantically for anything to use as a weapon. Spotting a broken branch, I grabbed it and swung at the beast. The makeshift club struck its side, but seemed to do little more than annoy it. The creature turned its attention to me, its eyes locking onto mine. In a desperate bid, I threw a rock at its head. It flinched, giving me a split second to act. I rushed to Trevor's side. He was conscious but badly injured. "We have to go," I urged. He grimaced. "I can't. You have to get out of here." "Not a chance," I said, hoisting him up. The beast shook off its momentary distraction and advanced slowly, almost as if savoring the hunt. Thinking quickly, I remembered the flare gun in my backpack, a safety measure I'd almost forgotten. I yanked it out, aimed at the creature, and fired. The flare struck its shoulder, erupting in a burst of light and sparks. The beast recoiled, letting out a pained howl. Seizing the opportunity, I half-dragged, half-carried Trevor as we made a desperate escape. We stumbled upon a narrow ravine, a gap too wide to jump, but with a fallen log bridging the sides. "Go," Trevor urged. Together, we scrambled across the log. Midway, the beast reappeared at the ravine's edge, eyes glowing with fury. It started across the log behind us. Once we reached the other side, I pulled out a lighter from my pocket. "Keep going," I yelled to Trevor. I set fire to the dry brush at our end of the log. Flames licked up the wood just as the creature was halfway across. It hesitated, but its momentum carried it forward. The fire weakened the log's structure, and with a loud crack, it snapped. The beast plunged into the ravine below, disappearing into the darkness. Breathing heavily, we didn't wait to see if it would resurface. We pushed onward until we broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a park ranger station. This one occupied. The rangers sprang into action upon seeing us. "What happened?" one demanded. "Some kind of animal attacked us," I managed to say between gasps. They called for medical assistance and alerted their teams. Trevor was taken to a nearby hospital, and I accompanied him in the ambulance. In the following days, park officials searched the area but found no trace of the creature. They did, however, discover remains from hikers reported missing over the past year. The authorities speculated about a rogue bear, but I knew that wasn't the case. Trevor underwent surgery but pulled through. When I visited him, he tried to lighten the mood. "Guess we won't be making the cover of Outdoor Magazine after all," he joked weakly. "Maybe not," I replied, "but we've got one heck of a story to tell." In the aftermath, the park officials decided to close off the Swift Creek Overlook Trail indefinitely. They cited unsafe conditions and potential wildlife hazards. As for the creature, theories abounded. A previously unknown species, a misidentified bear, even whispers of local legends come to life. Whatever it was, it remained a mystery. The experience didn't deter me from the outdoors, but it did teach me a valuable lesson about respecting the unpredictability of nature. My name's Dylan Gonzalez, and in 2013, I took my RV to a spot near Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska. I'm not a survivalist or a wilderness guide. I'm an accountant from Atlanta who got fed up with numbers and paperwork. So I figured I'd finally hit pause on life and spend a couple of weeks camping. I drove all the way from Georgia, chasing the quiet, thinking Alaska would be the kind of place where I could just sit back with a beer and let my brain go blank for a while. When I parked the RV in this isolated area just outside the national park, it felt perfect. Not a single person around. I was miles from the nearest campground, let alone a neighbor. And to me, that was ideal. I was setting up my little oasis when I noticed a couple of things off the bat that didn't sit right. The first was the absence of wildlife. I mean, it's Alaska, bears, moose, the whole lot. But around me, nothing. No scat on the ground, no broken branches from animals passing by, just silence, except for the faint rustling of leaves. By day 3, I'd settled into a good routine. Coffee in the morning, a short hike in the woods, then I'd grill up whatever canned meal I felt like eating. It was on one of these afternoon hikes that I stumbled across an old, half-collapsed wooden cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door was hanging off the hinges, and there was this strange smell around it. A mix of rotting wood and something sharper, kind of metallic. I figured it was rust from some old tool or metal scrap inside, so I brushed it off. But something didn't sit right with me. There were bits of clothing scattered around the area, shirts, old jackets, even a pair of jeans. Looked like they'd been there for years, frayed and faded by the weather. I don't know why, but I felt a chill. Part of me thought I should turn back, but another part, maybe the accountant side that just needs answers, thought I should go inside and take a look around. The interior was even worse. Dirt was caked on every surface. The floor was covered in what looked like animal bones, small ones, maybe birds or rabbits. And that same metallic smell was stronger now. I looked up and noticed something hanging from the ceiling. It was a hook, the kind you'd see in butcher shops. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of a forest. But it was there all the same, swaying slightly as if disturbed by some breeze that I couldn't feel. At that point, I decided to head back to the RV. I figured it was best to keep my distance from whatever strange things were left behind in that place. But when I stepped out of the cabin, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, faint and dragging behind me. I stopped, turned around, and waited. But nothing appeared. The forest around me was dead silent again. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I just psyched myself out. That night, though, I barely slept. I had brought a shotgun with me just in case of wildlife, and I kept it by my side. Every little noise outside felt amplified, like something was creeping around just out of sight. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Morning came, and I felt a bit stupid. I decided to spend the day fishing in a small creek I'd passed earlier, trying to distract myself. But even out by the water, that eerie silence remained. No birds chirping, no fish biting, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere behind me, which I tried my best to ignore. The thought that maybe I wasn't alone out here crept up more than once, and I started questioning if maybe I'd made a mistake coming out this far. Then, later that evening, as I was grilling up some fish, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just on the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but all I could make out was a figure. A man, maybe, crouching low, watching me. He was dressed in what looked like layers upon layers of dirty clothes, all torn up and mud-streaked, his face partially obscured by a tangle of hair. He was still as a statue, just watching. I shouted out to him, trying to play it cool, asking if he was lost, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly ducked back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. Every instinct told me I needed to pack up and leave. But stubborn as I was, I convinced myself that he was probably just some harmless drifter. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away. The next night, things escalated. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a scraping noise coming from outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something was being pulled along the side of the RV. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter than ever, listening. The scraping moved along the length of the vehicle, stopping right outside the window next to my bed. I didn't dare look out. For a solid hour, I just lay there, sweating, listening to the faint scratching on the metal. Then, silence. I finally drifted off, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, there were muddy handprints smeared along the side of the RV. That was enough for me. I started packing up my stuff, thinking I'd head back to the main road and find a new spot, maybe closer to a town. But as I loaded the last of my things, I spotted him again, standing a few yards away by a cluster of birch trees, staring at me with this blank, almost curious expression. He was holding a long, rusty blade, one that looked like it had seen far too much use, and his clothes were even filthier than before. I didn't think. I raised the shotgun and aimed at him, shouting for him to stay back. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and started to walk toward me, dragging that blade along the ground. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping he'd take the hint. But he kept coming, unfazed, picking up speed. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just wait around. I ran back into the RV, locked the door, and fired up the engine. But the man lunged at the driver's side window, slamming his fist against it, that rusty blade scraping along the glass. I stomped on the gas, swerving as he clung to the side, banging on the window, his face pressed against it with that same terrifying smile. The RV lurched forward, finally throwing him off balance, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. After what felt like an eternity, I hit the highway, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where I could finally breathe. The police in Anchorage were polite but skeptical. They took down my statement and checked out the muddy handprints on the RV, but all they could offer was a half-hearted promise to patrol the area. They didn't even sound like they believed me. Later, out of curiosity, or maybe just out of fear, I did some digging. I found a couple of stories about a man named Gideon, who was known to lurk in those woods. Rumored to be some kind of deranged hermit who'd lived there for decades, people said he'd lost his family in a hunting accident and went off the deep end, becoming obsessed with cleansing the forest of outsiders. My name is Alexander Wagner, and I'm 33 years old. I'm a wildlife biologist and an avid camper. I've always preferred the solitude of the woods to the chaos of city life. But what happened to me last October in Shade State Park changed the way I look at the wilderness forever. I wasn't just alone out there. I was being hunted. I'd just gone through a messy breakup and needed an escape. Shade State Park seemed like the perfect place to clear my head and refocus on my work. I had an article deadline looming about the biodiversity in Indiana state parks, and I figured a few nights in the woods would give me the peace I needed to write. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, parking my RV in one of the more secluded campsites near the edge of the park. The spot was surrounded by tall trees, their leaves starting to turn shades of orange and gold. A narrow ravine cut through the area, and the soft gurgle of a distant creek was the only sound as I set up my gear. I realized I'd forgotten to pack extra batteries for my flashlight. Amateur mistake, I muttered to myself. Still, I shrugged it off, figuring my phone's light would suffice if needed. I was more concerned about the thick fog rolling in. It clung to the ground, making the woods feel unnervingly still. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it for the first time, faint crying drifting through the trees. It sounded like a child, soft and pitiful. I froze, listening, my heart pounding. It wasn't unusual to hear strange noises in the woods, but this was different. The sound tugged at something deep inside me, like an instinct I couldn't ignore. "Hello?" I called, standing and shining my phone's light into the trees. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind. My gut told me to stay put, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone might need help. Grabbing my phone and a jacket, I ventured a few steps into the woods. "Is someone there?" I called again, my voice trembling. No answer, just the rustling of leaves as a light breeze picked up. After a few minutes of searching, I gave up and headed back to the RV, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. The next morning, I met Ranger Neil. He was making his rounds and stopped by my campsite to chat. He was in his 40s with a weathered face and a calm demeanor. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "You out here all alone?" "Yeah," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "I'm a biologist doing some research." "Ah, well, be careful," he said, glancing at the fog still clinging to the trees. "Shade's got its quirks. Folks around here like to tell stories about the crying woods." I raised an eyebrow. "The crying woods?" "Old legend," he said, leaning on his truck. "Back in the 30s, a little girl went missing out here. Family never found her. Some say you can still hear her crying, trying to lead people into the woods. Thing is, those who follow the sound don't always come back." I laughed nervously. "That's unsettling." Neil gave me a long, serious look. "Just stay on the trails, all right?" I nodded, but his words stuck with me. That day, I decided to explore a few trails and take notes for my article. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, full of vibrant colors and the earthy smell of fallen leaves. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour into my hike, I noticed footprints on the trail. They were small, like a child's, and barefoot. I stopped, frowning. What kind of parent lets their kid wander around here without shoes? The prints veered off the trail, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I crouched down to take a closer look. The edges of the prints were fresh, the soil still slightly damp. A chill ran down my spine. I stood quickly, deciding it was time to head back to the RV. That night, the crying returned. It started softly, just beyond the edge of the campsite. This time, it didn't stop when I called out. Instead, it grew louder, more desperate. "Help me," a small voice whimpered. My heart raced as I peered out the RV window. In the dim firelight, I saw her, a girl no older than 8, standing at the edge of the trees. She was barefoot, wearing a dirty white dress, her hair tangled and wild. She was crying, her shoulders shaking. "Hey," I called, grabbing my jacket. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, and for a moment our eyes met. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears, but her eyes, they were hollow, dark as the void. Before I could react, she turned and ran into the woods. "Wait!" I shouted, chasing after her. The fog swallowed me as I stumbled through the trees, calling for the girl. The crying grew fainter, pulling me deeper and deeper into the woods. My phone's light barely cut through the haze, and the trees seemed to close in around me. Finally, I stopped, gasping for breath. The crying had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I turned in a slow circle, realizing I had no idea where I was. My stomach sank. Then I saw it. A small, crumbling cabin hidden among the trees. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the windows were broken. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity won out. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light as I stepped over broken furniture and shattered glass. On a table in the corner, I found a stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age. My breath caught as I read the headline, "Local Girl Missing in Shade State Park." The date was from 1937. Beneath the article was a photograph of the girl. It was her, the same girl I'd seen in the woods. As I skimmed the article, a detail jumped out at me. The girl had been suspected of pushing her younger brother into a ravine shortly before her disappearance. She claimed it was an accident, but witnesses reported hearing the siblings arguing moments before the tragedy. A sudden sound made me whirl around. The crying had returned, louder now, echoing through the cabin. My hands shook as I backed toward the door. When I stepped outside, the girl was there, standing at the edge of the ravine. Her crying stopped as she turned to face me. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice laced with anger. "I didn't," I stammered, my throat dry. "I'm here to help." She took a step closer, and her face twisted. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Her eyes began to bleed, dark streaks running down her pale cheeks. "You'll stay with me," she said, her voice a distorted growl. The ground beneath me trembled, and I realized too late that I was standing at the edge of the ravine. Roots and dirt crumbled under my feet as the girl lunged at me, her hands clawing at my arms. I screamed, swinging my phone at her. The light catching her face, she recoiled, hissing like an animal, and vanished into the fog. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the forest floor, shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. The walk was a blur, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. When I finally locked myself inside, I collapsed onto the bed, clutching my knees to my chest. As I drove out of the park the next morning, I heard the crying one last time, faint and distant. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the road, watching me leave. I haven't gone back to Shade State Park since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear a child crying outside my window, and I know she's still waiting for me. This story highlights the chilling lure of a malevolent spirit preying on empathy and curiosity to trap its victims. I woke up that morning with a sense of unease. Something about the quiet was off. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart pound a little harder. My name's Gregory, and I'd driven out to the middle of nowhere in an RV hoping to get some peace and quiet. Life had been a series of endless loops, a carousel of monotony that I desperately needed to step off. The campsite was perfect, nestled in the thick woods of northern Michigan. It was isolated enough that you couldn't hear any traffic, just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves. I had my chair set up by the fire pit, and the coffee was brewing on the small stove inside the RV. My routine started with a morning hike. The path I'd chosen was well-trodden but still wild, the kind where you could easily believe you were the first person to step foot there in years. As I wandered deeper into the forest, the sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was fresh with that earthy smell that only a forest can have. I was about an hour into my hike when I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It was the kind of place you see in horror movies, but there was something oddly compelling about it. The door hung off its hinges, and the windows were shattered, giving it a skeletal look. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The inside of the cabin was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Old furniture was strewn about, and papers littered the floor. I bent down to pick up a yellowed piece of paper, which seemed to be a letter. It was hard to make out the faded ink, but the words "help" and "trapped" were unmistakable. Suddenly, A noise from outside caught my attention. It was a low rustling, like something or someone was moving through the underbrush. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly stuffed the letter into my pocket. Stepping outside, I looked around but saw nothing. The forest was eerily quiet again. I decided it was time to head back to the RV. The uneasy feeling had returned, stronger than before. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sped up my pace, eager to get back to the safety of my campsite. When I arrived, I found the RV door slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously stepped inside. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed the coffee pot was smashed on the floor and the contents of my backpack were scattered around. Someone had been here. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept in the RV and stepped back outside, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The woods around me seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent sentinels. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. He was tall and gaunt, with wild hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were fixed on me with a disturbing intensity. "Who are you?" I shouted, gripping the knife tighter. He didn't respond, just stood there staring. Then, slowly, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Who the hell was this guy, and what did he want? I wasn't about to let some creep ruin my escape from reality. I decided to follow him, keeping my distance, but staying close enough to keep him in sight. The man moved quickly through the forest, almost as if he knew it, like the back of his hand. I struggled to keep up, branches slapping against my face and thorns scratching my arms. After what felt like hours, we arrived at another clearing, this one dominated by a large, ominous-looking structure. It was an old warehouse, abandoned and overgrown with ivy. The man slipped inside through a broken window, and I cautiously followed. The interior of the warehouse was dark and musty. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. I could hear the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw him again, standing at the far end of the room. "Why are you following me?" he asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I should be asking you the same thing," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "What do you want from me?" He let out a low, humorless laugh. "You shouldn't have come here. This place isn't for people like you." I felt a surge of defiance. "And what exactly is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the warehouse. I hesitated for a moment before following him. We navigated through a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last. Finally, we arrived at a large open space that seemed to be some sort of makeshift living quarters. There were makeshift beds, old furniture, and even a small stove. "Welcome to my home," he said with a hint of sarcasm. "I've been living here for years." "Ever since I disappeared," he added. "Disappeared?" I asked, confused. "Yeah, disappeared. Like all those people you read about in the papers. Just vanished without a trace. Only I didn't vanish. I chose to live off the grid, away from society." I started to piece it together. This guy was one of those missing persons you hear about on the news, the ones who vanish and are never found. But he had chosen this life for reasons I couldn't understand. "Why?" I asked. "Why live like this?" He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Because society is broken. People are selfish, cruel, and deceitful. Out here, I'm free. I don't have to answer to anyone." "But you're not free," I argued. "You're trapped here, just like that letter said." His eyes flashed with anger. "You read the letter?" "Yeah, I did. Someone was asking for help." "Who was it?" He laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound. "That was me, a long time ago. I thought I wanted to be found, but then I realized I was better off alone." I felt a chill run through me. This guy was clearly unhinged. I needed to get out of there, and fast. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll just go, and we can both pretend this never happened." He shook his head. "I can't let you do that. You know too much." Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking the knife out of my hand. We struggled, rolling across the dirty floor. He was stronger than he looked, and I was quickly overpowered. He pinned me down, his hand closing around my throat. I gasped for air, my vision starting to blur. In a desperate move, I reached for a nearby piece of broken glass and slashed at his arm. He screamed in pain and released his grip. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the knife and running for the exit. I could hear him behind me, cursing and stumbling. I burst out of the warehouse and into the forest, running as fast as I could. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I broke through the trees and into the clearing where my RV was parked. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. There's a man. He's trying to kill me, I gasped. Stay calm, sir. Where are you? I gave them my location, praying they would get here in time. I could hear the man outside banging on the door and shouting. I grabbed the hunting rifle I kept in the RV, loading it with trembling hands. The banging stopped and everything went silent. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes felt like hours. Then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as I saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. The officers quickly surrounded the RV, weapons drawn. I opened the door, hands raised, and they rushed in, securing the area. They found the man a short distance away, bleeding and delirious. He was taken into custody and later identified as Leonard Bain, a man who had been missing for over a decade. The police found evidence of his crimes in the warehouse, the remains of several missing persons who had met a gruesome end at his hands. The story made headlines, and I was hailed as a hero for helping to bring him to justice. As the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The forest, which had once been a place of solace, now felt like a place of nightmares. I knew I'd never come back here, but I couldn't forget what happened. Leonard Bain had chosen his isolation, but it had driven him to madness, and I had stumbled into his dark world by chance. The authorities cleaned up the site, and the remains were identified and returned to their families. Life went on, but I was forever changed by that encounter. The scars on my neck were a constant reminder of how close I'd come to death. In the end, I realized that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't hiding in the dark. They're right there in plain sight, wearing the face of a man who just wanted to be left alone. And sometimes the only way to survive is to fight back, no matter how terrifying the odds. My name is Lila Carter, and I'm 35 years old. I'm a middle school teacher from Indiana. This happened in May of last year during a solo camping trip at Potato Creek State Park. At the time, I thought I just needed a weekend away, some time to decompress after the chaos of the school year. But what I found out there wasn't peace. It was something I don't think I'll ever truly escape. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, late enough that the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. Potato Creek is beautiful, with wide open lakes and dense forest trails that seem to stretch forever. I parked my old RV at the site near the water and set up my little camp. A folding chair by the fire pit, my journal, and pens on the picnic table. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed. The first issue popped up almost immediately. The generator on my RV wouldn't stay on for more than a few minutes before sputtering out. I cursed under my breath. Without it, I wouldn't have power for lights or to charge my phone. I reminded myself I'd come here to unplug anyway and shrugged it off. As I was unpacking, I noticed something odd. A deer stood at the edge of the woods, staring directly at me. That wasn't unusual in itself, but the way it stood there, perfectly still like a statue, sent a ripple of unease through me. When I waved my arms to scare it off, it didn't flinch. It just turned its head slightly as if trying to understand me, then disappeared into the trees. I tried not to think about it as I made dinner. Night fell quickly, bringing a heavy silence with it. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It was unsettling. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, and that's when I heard that whistling. It was faint at first, just a few notes carried by the breeze. I assumed it was another camper, but when I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't coming from the nearby sites. It was coming from deep in the woods. I don't know why, but the sound unsettled me. I went inside the RV and locked the door. When I checked my phone, I saw that I had no signal. Not surprising, given how remote the area was. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were strange that night. I kept hearing someone whispering my name over and over. When I finally woke up, drenched in sweat, I realized the RV door was slightly ajar. My heart nearly stopped. I was certain I'd locked it before going to bed. The next morning, I decided to shake off the weirdness and go for a hike. The fresh air felt good, and I started to relax as I walked the trails. That's when I saw the footprints. They were barefoot, large, but with long, twisted toes, almost like claws. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. They appeared out of nowhere in the dirt and led off the trail into the dense underbrush. I stood there, staring at them, my gut telling me to turn back, but I shook it off. It's just some weird animal, I told myself. Probably a bear. When I got back to my campsite, I met Jodon. He was camping a few sites down and seemed about my age, mid-30s, with a friendly smile and a bit of a nosy streak. "You camping alone?" he asked, glancing at my RV. I nodded and he raised an eyebrow. "You're braver than me. This place has a weird vibe, you know?" I laughed nervously and tried to brush him off, but he kept talking. "You heard the stories about this area? The skinwalker legend?" I shook my head, even though the word sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard it before somewhere, but I couldn't remember the details. "It's an old Native American story," Jodon explained. "They say it's a shapeshifter, a spirit that can take the form of anything it wants. People, animals. It mimics voices, tries to lure you into the woods. Once you see it, you're pretty much screwed." He grinned, like it was all a big joke, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Thanks for the bedtime story," I said dryly, trying to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the knot forming in my stomach. That night, I heard the whistling again, louder this time. It started faint, like the night before, but it grew closer and closer until it sounded like it was right outside the RV. Then it stopped, replaced by silence. I stayed perfectly still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lila," a voice called softly. My blood turned to ice. It was my voice. "Lila," it said again, this time with a strange rasping tone. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a flashlight, and crept toward the window. My hands were shaking as I peeked outside. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed something standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It looked like me, but wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its face twisted into a grotesque grin. I stumbled back, my heart racing. No, I whispered, barely able to breathe. The thing outside started scratching at the RV door, slow and deliberate, the sound making my skin crawl. "Lila, let me in," it said, still using my voice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the corner of the RV, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, I dared to open the door. There were long claw marks running down the side of the RV, and my campsite was in disarray. Chairs knocked over, food scattered everywhere. Jodon's campsite was silent. When I went to check on him, his tent was slashed open, and his belongings were strewn about like mine. A dark stain, blood, I realized, marked the ground near the fire pit. I called out for him, but there was no answer. Panic set in. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I needed to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. The thing had done something to it. I was sure of it. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do, I heard Jodon's voice calling from the woods. "Lila, over here. I need help." It sounded desperate, terrified. "Jodon?" I called back, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" "Just a little further," his voice replied. I froze. Something about the tone wasn't right. It was too flat, too monotone, and then I remembered what Jodon had said about the skinwalker mimicking voices. My blood ran cold. "I'm not falling for it," I muttered, backing away from the tree line. That's when I saw it. The thing stepped out from the woods. Its body hunched and twisted. It shifted forms right in front of me. going from Jodon to me to something else entirely, something grotesque with long clawed fingers and glowing yellow eyes. It let out a guttural, inhuman screech and started toward me. I ran back into the RV and slammed the door shut just as the creature reached it. It pounded on the sides, the force shaking the whole vehicle. I grabbed a bag of salt from the cupboard. I remembered hearing somewhere that salt could ward off evil spirits, and poured a circle around myself. The pounding stopped. The creature's face appeared at the window, grinning at me with razor-sharp teeth. It snarled, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. "You can't hide forever, Lila," it hissed, its voice a sickening mixture of mine and Jadon's. "I'll see you soon." It disappeared as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. I stayed in that circle until I was sure it was gone. When I finally dared to step outside, I saw that the creature had carved something into the hood of the RV. "You can't run." I left Potato Creek that morning, abandoning the RV and walking to the nearest ranger station to call for help. They found Jadon's body 2 days later, deep in the woods. His injuries were so horrific that they wouldn't tell me the details. I haven't gone camping since. I don't know if I ever will, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whistling outside my window, and I know it's still out there, waiting for me. My name is Wesley Crane. It's 2015, and I'm sitting in an RV park just outside Yellowstone, wondering how the hell I got here. I'm not really the outdoorsy type, to be honest, but after my divorce last year, I thought it'd be good for me to get away from everything. Clear my head, do the whole finding myself thing. I bought an old RV, thinking I'd hit the open road and maybe grow some stubble while pretending to know what I'm doing. I work as an accountant, so my idea of adventure usually involves tax loopholes, not whatever I just went through. To set the stage, I'm parked at this quiet little site, nothing but me, some trees, and the occasional squirrel to keep me company. The park is gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but there's something unnerving about how isolated it feels. You don't realize how much noise there is in a city until you're somewhere like this, where the silence itself is almost loud. I had been camping out for a couple of days already, pretending to enjoy my lukewarms of beans and the lack of decent Wi-Fi when I decided to venture out a little farther than usual. There's this trail that winds up through the woods just past where I parked. A real postcard kind of place. I figured I'd hike for an hour or two, then come back, maybe crack open a beer and convince myself I was becoming a nature guy. The first part of the walk was fine, quiet, peaceful even. There wasn't a soul in sight, which I thought was kind of weird for the height of tourist season, but I figured everyone else had more sense than to hike alone. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe a film set I'd accidentally wandered into. There was an RV, not unlike mine, tucked into a small clearing just off the path, but it was trashed. Not like bear attack trashed, but methodical, almost surgical. Doors hanging off, windows smashed, the roof torn out in places. It didn't look like the kind of damage nature could do. No, this was something more deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail to check it out. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. It wasn't just the damage, it was the atmosphere. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My stomach churned with the kind of unease you can't quite put into words, like you've just remembered something horrible you'd tried to forget. I stopped short of the RV's door, realizing I didn't want to see inside, but by then I'd already seen too much. There was blood. Splashes of it across the side of the vehicle, like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint at it. And there was more, drag marks leading from the RV into the woods. It didn't take a genius to know something bad had happened here. I should have turned back right then, sprinted down that trail, and never looked back. But no, like an idiot, I stepped closer. Inside, the place was torn apart, furniture overturned, dishes shattered on the floor, personal belongings scattered everywhere. It was like someone had been living there 1 second, and then suddenly, wasn't. The worst part, though, wasn't the blood or the destruction. It was the suitcase. A half-packed suitcase sitting on the bed as if someone had been about to leave but never got the chance. I'm not sure how long I stood there just staring at it, my brain trying to catch up with what I was seeing. Long enough, apparently, for the owner of the RV to come back. It was a sound, a twig snapping behind me, that jolted me out of my stupor. I turned around so fast I nearly tripped over myself, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, but that wasn't what set off the alarm bells in my head. It was the look on his face, a kind of calm that didn't belong in a scene like this. He wasn't surprised to see me. In fact, it felt like he'd been expecting me. He stepped closer, too close for comfort, and my mouth went dry. He had this casual way about him, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wasn't worried about consequences. His clothes were dirty, but not in the "I've been camping" way. More like, "I've been living out here, away from the law" kind of dirty. "You lost?" His voice was quiet, controlled, not threatening, but definitely not friendly either. I stammered out some excuse about getting off the trail, how I didn't mean to intrude, but the way he looked at me, it was like he could see right through the lies. He glanced at the RV, then back at me, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. I'll tell you this, people talk about fight or flight, but there's a third option they don't always mention: freeze. And that's exactly what I did, like a deer in headlights, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then he smiled, and that's when I knew I was screwed. I don't remember much about what happened next. 1 second, he was a few feet away, and the next he was on me, hands around my neck, squeezing. I don't even think he was trying to kill me. Not yet, just testing me, like a cat plays with a mouse. I thrashed, managed to elbow him in the ribs, and for a second, his grip loosened just enough for me to get away. I ran blindly, stupidly, crashing through the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy but unhurried, like he knew the woods better than I ever could. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks tripping me up, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. If I stopped, I was dead. Eventually, I burst back onto the main trail, my lungs on fire, legs shaking like jelly. I half collapsed behind a boulder, trying to quiet my breathing, praying he hadn't followed, but I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled in that spot, waiting. Time felt strange, stretched out, like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare loop, but he never came. When I finally mustered the courage to move, I bolted back to the RV park, not stopping until I slammed the door of my camper shut behind me. For the next few hours, I sat in silence, too scared to even peek out the windows. But nothing happened. No knocks on the door, no shadowy figure lurking in the trees, just the oppressive weight of everything I'd seen. I don't know why I didn't call the cops right then and there. Maybe part of me didn't believe it really happened, or maybe I was just too damn scared. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the RV made me jump. Every gust of wind had me convinced he was out there, waiting for me to slip up. The next morning, I packed up and left, driving as far and as fast as I could. I didn't look back, not once. A few days later, after I'd put some distance between me and Yellowstone, curiosity got the better of me. I did some digging. Turns out, the guy I ran into had a name: Harvey Dunn, former Marine, dishonorably discharged for reasons that were never made public. He'd gone off the grid about 5 years ago, and there were rumors, ugly ones, about people who'd crossed his path and never been seen again. Authorities had been looking for him, but he was like a ghost, popping up in random places, always just out of reach. The RV I found? It belonged to a couple from Ohio. Their bodies were discovered 2 weeks later, buried not far from where I'd been. So yeah, I got lucky. Real lucky. But Harvey's still out there, and I've got a feeling our paths will cross again. Maybe next time I won't be so lucky. My name is Nicholas Harris, and I'm 57 years old. This happened in the fall of 2022, just after I retired as a forest ranger. I had spent over 30 years in the wilderness patrolling trails, chasing off bears, and sometimes even helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. You'd think a man like me would have no reason to be afraid of the woods, but I'm telling you what I experienced in the Hoare National Forest will haunt me for the rest of my days. I had just bought an old RV, a 1988 Winnebago. Nothing fancy, but it ran well enough. The plan was simple: park it somewhere secluded, spend a few days camping, and finally get the peace I had been craving. My wife, Catherine, used to love trips like this. She passed 5 years ago in a hiking accident, one I couldn't prevent, and I still carry the guilt of it. I thought this trip might help me reconnect with her memory, and maybe even forgive myself. I chose the Sycamore Trail in Hoare National Forest. It's not as busy as some of the other spots, and I knew the land like the back of my hand. The locals had always told stories about the area, warnings to stay away from certain trails, whispers of things that didn't belong in those woods. But I'd always chalked it up to superstition. After all, the forest can play tricks on your mind if you're not used to it. The first day went smoothly enough. I parked the RV in a small clearing just off the trailhead. It was a gorgeous spot, the kind of place Catherine would have loved. There was a crisp chill in the air, and the trees were blazed with autumn colors. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked myself a simple meal of canned chili. The only problem was my equipment. My old flashlight was flickering, and my camp stove gave me trouble lighting up. Nothing major, just annoyances, or so I thought. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves. Just dead silence. Then, just as I was about to head inside the RV, I heard something. Nicholas. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was calling my name. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like Catherine. Nicholas, help me. The voice was coming from deep in the woods, beyond the reach of my firelight. My heart was racing. I told myself it couldn't be her. It couldn't. But it sounded so real, so desperate. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. I didn't go far. My flashlight barely worked, and the further I moved from the fire, the darker and colder it got. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the mud. They were strange, like a mix between human footprints and animal paw prints, as if someone had been walking barefoot but with claws. They led in a wide circle around my RV before disappearing into the woods. I stood there staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of them. That's when I heard the voice again, closer this time. Nicholas, please, it hurts. It was Catherine, or at least it sounded like her. Who's there? I shouted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound tough. The forest didn't answer. I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering, and retreated to the safety of the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a bird mimicking her voice, maybe I was hearing things, but deep down I knew better. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the morning exploring the trail, hoping a good hike would clear my head. The woods were still unnervingly quiet, but nothing unusual happened. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That's when the rain started. Light at first, then heavy. I sprained my ankle slipping on the wet ground while fetching firewood, cursing under my breath as I hobbled back to the RV. The storm made the forest even darker, and the flickering flashlight wasn't much help. That night, I heard scratching. It started faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Something, or someone, was outside. I peered through the window, but all I saw was darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp knocks on the side of the RV, followed by silence. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my hunting rifle and edged toward the door. My heart pounded as I threw it open, aiming into the night. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the faintest outline of a figure in the trees, tall and impossibly thin. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood only to find deep scratches gouged into the metal, like claw marks. My chest tightened. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike out, sprained ankle or not. But as I started down the trail, the forest seemed different. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker, the air thick, oppressive. Every step I took felt like I was being watched. Then I saw it. It was standing in the middle of the trail, about 50 yards ahead. At first it looked human, long limbs, pale skin. But as I stepped closer, its head jerked unnaturally, and its body twisted, bending in ways no human body should. It turned toward me, and I swear it smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "Nicholas, back," it said in Catherine's voice. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. It started walking toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached the old fire tower, I climbed up, hoping the height would give me an advantage. The creature followed. It circled the base of the tower, its voice shifting between Catherine's pleas and a low guttural growl. "Nicholas, don't leave me," it whispered, its voice distorted and mocking. I remembered the stories, the ones I used to laugh at, skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic voices, take on forms, and lure people to their deaths. The locals had always said salt could repel them. It was worth a shot. I dug into my pack and poured a ring of salt around the platform, gripping my rifle tightly. The creature climbed halfway up the tower, but as it neared the salt, it recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing shriek. It stared at me for a long moment, its dark eyes burning with rage, before it slithered back down the ladder and disappeared into the woods. When the sun rose, I climbed down the tower, my legs trembling. The forest felt lighter, less oppressive, but the tracks in the mud told me the creature was still out there. I hobbled back to the RV, praying the engine would start. This time, it did. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it standing at the edge of the forest. It didn't follow me, but I knew it was watching. I haven't been back to the Hoare National Forest since. I sold the RV, gave up camping, and tried to move on. But at night, I still hear Catherine's voice calling to me from the darkness, and I'll never forget those eyes. My name is Michael Lopez, and I'm 25 years old. This happened in October of last year when my best friend Sophia and I decided to spend a weekend camping at Dogwood Lake, deep in the heart of southern Indiana. I'll never forget those days, no matter how hard I try. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter. Sophia and I couldn't have been more different. She was bold, impulsive, and always looking for her next adventure. I, on the other hand, preferred plans, structure, and knowing exactly what I was walking into. But she had a way of pulling me out of my comfort zone, and I usually ended up having a good time. Usually, we'd rented an old RV for the trip, a boxy white thing with a sputtering engine that smelled faintly of mildew. I'd suggested staying in a cabin, but Sophia insisted the RV would be more authentic. After some back and forth, I gave in, as I always did. Besides, I was desperate for a break. My teaching job had been wearing me down, and Sophia's promise of crisp autumn air, hiking trails, and kayaking sounded like the reset I needed. We arrived at Dogwood Recreation Area in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops. The forest was alive with color, fiery reds, deep oranges, and golden yellows that reflected off the still surface of the lake. It was beautiful, but something about the place felt off. I chalked it up to exhaustion and a touch of nerves. Sophia, of course, was thrilled. She grabbed her camera and started snapping photos the moment we parked. "Look at this light," she gushed. "It's perfect." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. That was Sophia, always chasing the perfect shot. After setting up camp, we decided to explore. There was a well-marked trailhead nearby, but Sophia had other ideas. She'd spotted a faint path leading off into the woods, one that wasn't on the map. "Let's check it out," she said, already heading in that direction. "Are you serious? It's getting dark," I protested. "That's the best time for photos," she called over her shoulder. "Come on, Michael, don't be such a buzzkill." Reluctantly, I followed. The trail, if you could call it that, was narrow and overgrown, twisting through dense trees that blocked out what little sunlight remained. I kept tripping over roots and brushing cobwebs from my face, muttering under my breath about poison ivy and ticks. Sophia, meanwhile, was in her element, snapping pictures of moss-covered rocks and fallen leaves. Then she found it. At first I thought it was just a piece of trash, something shiny poking out of the dirt. But when Sophia bent down and picked it up, I realized it was a locket, an old one, tarnished and rusted, but still intact. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Can you believe this? It's so vintage." "It's gross," I said. "Put it back." But she ignored me, rubbing the locket clean on her sleeve. "It's got initials engraved on it. I wonder who it belonged to." "Does it matter? It's trash." She shot me a look. "It's not trash, it's history." Then she slipped the locket into her pocket. "I'm keeping it." I didn't argue. What was the point? Sophia was stubborn, and once she'd made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. That night, things started to feel strange. The heater in the RV wouldn't work, so we huddled under blankets, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there watching us. But when I mentioned it to Sophia, she laughed it off. "You're just spooked because it's so quiet out here," she said. "City girl problems." Maybe she was right. I told myself I was imagining things, and eventually drifted off to sleep. Then the dreams started. I was standing by the lake, staring at the water. A woman stood on the shore, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore a dress that clung to her as if it were soaked. She was holding something, a locket, I realized. Her shoulders shook as though she were crying, but no sound came out. When she turned around, her face was a mask of rage, her eyes hollow and black. She opened her mouth to scream, and I woke up gasping for air. Across the RV, Sophia was sound asleep, the locket clutched in her hand. The next day, Sophia acted normal, but I couldn't shake the dream. I told her about it over breakfast, expecting her to laugh it off again. Instead, she frowned. "That's weird," she said. "I had a dream, too, about a woman at the lake." "What did she do?" "She was just standing there, watching me," she shrugged. "It didn't feel scary, though, just sad." I wasn't convinced. Something about the locket wasn't right, but Sophia refused to get rid of it. "It's just a coincidence," she said. "Don't freak out." But as the day went on, the unease grew. Wet footprints appeared on the RV floor, even though neither of us had been near the water. Items went missing. A flashlight, Sophia's phone charger, only to turn up later in odd places. And then there were the voices. That evening, as we sat by the fire, I heard it. The faint sound of children laughing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but Sophia heard it too. "Probably just echoes from another campsite," she said, though her tone was less certain. "There's no one else out here," I whispered. We stared into the darkness, but the laughter faded as quickly as it had come. That night, I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sophia's bed was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my heart pounding. The forest was pitch black, the trees casting long shadows under the sliver of moonlight. I found Sophia standing at the edge of the lake, her feet submerged in the water. She was holding the locket, her lips moving as if she were whispering something, though I couldn't hear the words. "Sophia!" I yelled. She turned slowly, her eyes glazed over. "She wants me to stay," she said, her voice distant and hollow. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back to the RV, but she fought me, her strength unnaturally strong. "Let go. I need to go to her." Finally, I managed to drag her inside and lock the door. She collapsed onto her bed and fell into a deep sleep, but I stayed awake, clutching a knife and listening for the sound of footsteps outside. The next morning, Sophia didn't remember a thing. She laughed it off, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The locket's influence was growing stronger, and I knew we had to leave. But the RV wouldn't start. Sophia tried to call for help, but her phone was dead, even though it had been fully charged the night before. I suggested walking back to the main road, but she refused. "I'm not leaving the RV," she said. "What if someone comes by?" I didn't argue. I couldn't leave her alone, not when she was acting so strange. Instead, I decided to confront the problem head-on. That afternoon, while Sophia was napping, I took the locket and walked to the lake. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. I stood at the water's edge, the locket heavy in my hand. "I know you're here," I said. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface of the lake rippled, and the woman appeared. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark pits of sorrow and rage. Behind her, shadowy figures emerged, children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. "Return it," she hissed, her voice like nails on glass. "Return what you stole." I threw the locket into the water and turned to run, but the children's laughter erupted around me, and I felt icy hands grab my ankles. I screamed, kicking and clawing, but the hands dragged me toward the water. Just as I thought I was going to drown, Sophia appeared, her face twisted with fear and determination. She held a stick lit with fire from the RV's stove. "Let her go," she screamed, thrusting the flame toward the water. The ghostly figures recoiled, their shrieks piercing the air. Sophia grabbed my arm and pulled me back to shore. Together, we watched as the locket sank beneath the surface, the ripples fading into stillness. We left Dogwood Lake the next day, abandoning the RV and hitchhiking back to civilization. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but I knew we'd both been changed. Sophia never picked up her camera again, and I can't look at a lake without feeling a chill run down my spine. Some nights, I still hear the laughter, soft and distant, like an echo from a nightmare. I pray it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know it's not. My name is Camila Adams. I'm 22 years old, and this happened to me last November. It started as a camping trip in Brown County State Park, Indiana. Just a fun, challenging escape with friends. But what I experienced out there wasn't just nature. Something ancient and evil stalked us through that forest, and I barely made it out alive. It was Mason's idea. He was the ringleader in our group of 3, confident, outdoorsy, and just reckless enough to convince us this trip was a good idea. He was 26, with that charming, cocky smile that somehow made me trust him even when I shouldn't. Then there was Ben, Mason's best friend since childhood. He was 25, and the opposite of Mason, reserved, practical, and constantly trying to keep us from getting into trouble. Me? I was just there for the adventure. I'd been feeling stuck lately, living the same routine in Indianapolis, and Mason's enthusiasm made me want to break out of my comfort zone. So when he suggested we tackle an unofficial trail he'd found on some wilderness forum, I thought, why not? We packed light. Mason insisted we didn't need much for a 3-day trip. Looking back, that was mistake number 1. The first day went fine. We parked at the trailhead and hiked deeper into the park than I'd ever been. The colors of the late autumn forest were stunning, rich reds and golds under a steel gray sky. Mason led the way with his usual bravado, joking about how we didn't even need a map because he had the route all figured out. Ben kept muttering about how we should at least double-check our bearings, but Mason brushed him off. By the time we reached our first campsite, we were tired, but in good spirits. We set up a small fire, ate some protein bars, and talked about everything and nothing under the canopy of stars. It was peaceful until the forest went silent. I didn't notice it at first, but Ben did. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Mason replied, poking at the fire. "Nothing," Ben said. "No crickets, no owls, nothing." Now that he mentioned it, the silence felt wrong. It pressed down on us like a weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mason shrugged it off, saying it was probably the cold weather, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The second day was harder. The hidden path Mason had raved about turned out to be more of a rough deer trail, barely visible under the thick leaves. My legs ached from climbing over fallen trees and trudging through uneven ground. To make matters worse, Ben's compass stopped working. He swore it had been fine yesterday, but now the needle spun uselessly, as if the forest itself was messing with us. Around midday, we found something strange. Deep claw marks scored the bark of a massive oak tree. They were too high up to be from a bear, if there were even bears in this part of Indiana. Mason joked about Bigfoot, but Ben's face darkened. "This isn't right," Ben said. "We should turn back." "Turn back? Come on, man, we're fine," Mason said. "Don't wimp out now." Ben shot me a look that said, "Can you believe this guy?" I wanted to agree with him, but I didn't want to be the one to back down first. So we kept going. That night, the hunger started. Mason devoured most of our food. He claimed he hadn't eaten enough earlier and needed the energy, but the way he tore through the rations was unsettling. His hands shook as he unwrapped granola bars, and his eyes had this wild, hollow look. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just starving," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. "Don't worry about it." Ben pulled me aside while Mason stomped off to gather more firewood. "Something's wrong with him," Ben whispered. "He's acting off." "I know," I said. "But what are we supposed to do? Drag him back to the car?" Ben didn't answer. He just stared into the dark woods, his jaw tight. Later that night, I heard whispering. I'd stepped away from the campfire to use the bathroom. The air was freezing, my breath puffing white in front of me. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy murmur just beyond the tree line. "Ben? Mason?" I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, too far away to be either of them. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" Mason asked when he saw me. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "Someone's out there," I said, trying to catch my breath. "I heard them." "It's probably just the wind," Mason said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ben pulled out the flimsy flashlight Camila had packed, the beam flickering weakly as he scanned the surrounding trees. "We need to leave first thing in the morning," he said. Morning didn't come fast enough. I woke up to the sound of Mason vomiting behind the tent. When I went to check on him, I saw blood mixed in with the bile. "You're sick," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We have to get you out of here." "No," Mason rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Ben snapped. "You look like death, and now we're out of food, thanks to you." Mason glared at him, his teeth bared. For a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at Ben, but then he stumbled back, clutching his stomach. "Let's just keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. We packed up and started hiking, but Mason was slower now, his breath labored. The trail seemed to twist in on itself, leading us deeper into the forest instead of out. The claw marks appeared more frequently, gouged into the trees like some kind of territorial warning. And then we found the carcass. It was a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its ribs jutted out like spears, the flesh stripped away as if something had gnawed on it. The smell was overwhelming, rotting meat and coppery blood. Mason stared at it for a long time, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We need to keep moving," Ben said, grabbing my arm. That night, Mason disappeared. Ben and I woke up to find his sleeping bag empty, his boots gone. "We have to find him," I said, but Ben shook his head. "He's gone, Camila. We can't save him." "We can't just leave him out there," I yelled. Ben sighed, his face lined with exhaustion. "Fine, but if we don't find him by sunset, we're heading back." We followed a faint trail of footprints, half expecting to find Mason sitting by a tree, laughing about some stupid prank. Instead, we found him crouched over another deer carcass, his face smeared with blood. "Mason?" I called out softly. He turned to look at us, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were sunk, his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones, his lips pulled back in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too jagged. "The hunger," he whispered. "It's inside me." Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me back. "Run," he said. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, but Mason, or whatever he'd become, was fast. I could hear him behind us, his ragged breathing growing louder, closer. "Go!" Ben shouted, shoving me forward. "I'll hold him off." "No!" I screamed, but Ben didn't stop. He turned to face Mason, wielding a large branch like a spear. I didn't see what happened next. I just kept running, tears streaming down my face as I heard Ben's screams echoing through the trees. I stumbled out of the forest at dawn, bloodied and half frozen. Park rangers found me near the trailhead and took me to a hospital. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said Mason and Ben probably got lost and that I was lucky to make it out alive. But I know the truth. Somewhere in those woods, the Wendigo still roams, hungry and waiting for its next victim. My name's Samuel Neven, and back in 2004, I was working as a search and rescue officer in the Daniel Boone National Forest, Kentucky. I didn't grow up around here, though. I came from Indiana, a flat, uneventful place where the most excitement you'd get was a speeding ticket. The move to Kentucky was supposed to bring some adventure, and let me tell you, I got more than I bargained for. When I first got into this line of work, people said it was mainly about finding lost hikers or kids who wandered off the trails. They didn't warn me about the other things in the woods, the things you can't categorize. You see, I wasn't exactly what you'd call an experienced outdoorsman before I took this job. The closest I got to wildlife was grilling burgers in my backyard. But the forest grew on me. It felt like freedom. That was until the day it stopped feeling safe. It was mid-afternoon when the call came in. 2 campers, both young men, had gone missing near Red River Gorge. They had set out the previous morning and hadn't checked back with their friends. That wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. People lose track of time out here all the time. But something about the tone of the call had me on edge. Their friends said they weren't the type to just disappear without a trace. I grabbed my gear and met up with my partner, Carl, an older guy who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive. He had that look of someone who'd seen it all, but didn't say much about it. As we drove out to the trailhead, Carl kept tapping the wheel like he had something on his mind. Finally, he said, "You ever hear about that thing up in the gorge?" I glanced at him. "What thing?" He didn't answer right away. "Never mind," he muttered. "Just some stories the locals like to tell to scare tourists." We pulled up to the trailhead where we met the friends of the 2 missing campers. They were all rattled, wide-eyed, and shuffling nervously like something bad had already happened. One of them, a guy with a red bandana wrapped around his head, said they had been hiking together when the 2 missing guys went ahead, wanting to explore a cave they'd found. The rest of the group stayed back, and when their friends didn't return by nightfall, they started worrying. Carl, never one for comforting words, just grunted and motioned for me to follow him. We set out on the trail, winding through dense trees and jagged cliffs. The forest was quiet, too quiet. You start to notice these things when you've been out here long enough. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind and our footsteps crunching on the dirt. "Shouldn't there be, some wildlife or something?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Carl didn't respond, just picked up the pace, which wasn't exactly reassuring. About an hour in, we found the campsite the missing campers had set up. Tents were there, unzipped, sleeping bags tossed around like they'd left in a hurry. A couple of backpacks were strewn across the ground. What was strange, though, was that there were no signs of a struggle, just an eerie sense of abandonment. I crouched down near one of the backpacks, rifling through it for clues. Inside, I found the usual camping gear, but then I pulled out something odd, a torn piece of fur. It was coarse, thicker than anything I'd seen on a bear or deer. I showed it to Carl, but he just shrugged it off, mumbling something about wild animals. As we moved further into the forest, the trees began to close in around us, their twisted limbs casting distorted shadows on the ground. I felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, nothing was there. About half a mile later, we came across something that made my blood run cold. One of the missing campers was slumped against a tree, his body mangled beyond recognition. His torso was torn open, jagged cuts running along his chest and arms, as if something had sliced him up with claws or teeth. There was no blood on the ground, though, which made it even more unsettling. Whatever did this didn't just kill him, it took its time. I staggered back, feeling bile rise in my throat. Carl knelt down to examine the body, his face grim but not surprised. "This isn't normal," he muttered. No kidding, I whispered. What could have done this? Carl stood up slowly, scanning the area. Not sure, but we need to find the other one. The other one, right. There were two. I had almost forgotten. My mind was still reeling from the sight in front of me. But we had a job to do. We pressed on, following a faint trail of broken branches and disturbed underbrush. It was getting darker, but we couldn't turn back now. About an hour later, we found the second camper, or at least what was left of him. His body was hanging from a tree, suspended by a mess of vines and branches. It looked like he'd been lifted up and shredded apart, his limbs dangling at odd angles. I could barely breathe at this point. It was like we had stumbled into some twisted hunting ground. We should call this in, I said, my voice shaking. Carl didn't move. He was staring at something off to the side, just beyond the body. Look! I followed his gaze and saw it. Movement in the trees. Something was crouching low, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It was huge, larger than anything I'd ever seen before. Its body was covered in matted fur, like that of a wild boar, but its movements were more feline, smooth and predatory. The creature's head was elongated, almost like a wolf's, but it had this strange, twisted quality to it, as if nature had gone wrong somewhere. It stood there for a moment, staring at us, before letting out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in my chest. Carl grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my daze. Run? I always figured if anything bad ever happened to me, it would be out on the open road, miles away from anyone who could help. Maybe that's why I started carrying a gun. I never wanted to feel helpless. Not that I've had to use it before, but it's there, tucked under the seat of my rig, just in case. The highway was quieter than usual that night, and I was heading west, cutting through some remote stretch of Wyoming. The air was crisp, a bite of winter hanging on, even though it should have been warmer by now. I had a load of lumber bound for some construction site in Idaho. Nothing out of the ordinary. My mind was on the job. The kind of solitary thinking that comes when you're hours into a long haul. It wasn't until I hit the small, nearly forgotten town of Pine Ridge that things started to feel off. Not that there was much to the place. A single gas station, a diner that looked like it hadn't served a hot meal in years, and a couple of houses with their windows boarded up. I needed to refuel, so I pulled into the gas station, the only sign of life in the whole town. The pump was ancient, the kind where you have to flip the lever to start the gas flowing. As I filled up, I noticed the attendant inside the station, a wiry man with a weathered face. He was watching me, his eyes never leaving me. I gave him a nod, more out of habit than friendliness, but he didn't respond, just kept staring like he was sizing me up. It made my skin crawl, but I chalked it up to small-town suspicion. Strangers don't exactly roll through Pine Ridge every day. I paid for the gas and got back in the truck, eager to put some miles between me and that town. As I pulled out, I noticed an old beat-up pickup truck parked on the side of the road. I hadn't seen it when I pulled in, but then again, I wasn't paying much attention. The thing looked like it hadn't run in years, rust eating away at the body and the tires flat against the pavement. An hour later, the road was deserted, just a ribbon of black cutting through the wilderness. That's when I saw the headlights in my mirror. At first, it was just a faint glow, but they got closer. Fast. Too fast. My heart picked up, and I checked my speed. Maybe I was going too slow, but no, I was doing the limit. The lights got brighter, and I could make out the outline of the vehicle behind me. It was that old pickup from Pine Ridge, the same rusted hulk that looked like it shouldn't even be on the road. I kept my eyes on the mirror, expecting the truck to pass me by, but it didn't. Instead, it rode my tail, the headlights nearly blinding me. I tapped the brakes, a warning, but the pickup didn't back off. If anything, it got closer. Something wasn't right. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the pickup matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. The road ahead was nothing but darkness, and my mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I reached under the seat, feeling for the cold metal of the gun. My hand gripped the handle, but I didn't pull it out, not yet. There was a turn up ahead, A sharp one. I could lose him there, maybe. I flicked on my blinker, even though there was no one else around to see it, and took the turn hard. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. The road curved through a dense patch of trees, and I couldn't see the headlights anymore. But then they reappeared, brighter than before, as the pickup tore around the bend, nearly clipping the back of my rig. Panic set in, and I floored it, the engine roaring as I pushed the truck faster than I'd ever dared before. The pickup stayed with me, relentless. I couldn't shake him. And then, like something out of a nightmare, he started ramming me. The first hit jolted me so hard I almost lost control. My trailer fishtailed, the weight of the lumber threatening to tip the whole rig over. I gripped the wheel tighter, fighting to keep us on the road. Another hit, harder this time, and I knew I had to do something, or he'd run me off the road completely. I glanced at the gun still under the seat, but the thought of using it while driving terrified me. Instead, I scanned the road ahead, looking for anything that might help. Up ahead, I saw a narrow dirt road branching off to the right. It wasn't on my map, and I had no idea where it led, but it was my only option. I cut the wheel hard, veering off the main road onto the dirt path. The rig shuddered as the tires hit the rough ground, and I prayed the trailer wouldn't flip. The pickup followed right on my tail, its headlights bouncing in the darkness. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck, and lined with thick trees on either side. I could hear the pickup's engine roaring behind me, getting closer and closer. My mind raced with desperate ideas, none of them good. I could try to lose him in the trees, but one wrong move, and I'd be wrapped around a trunk. And then, out of nowhere, the road ended. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding in the dirt, and the rig came to a stop just inches from a steep drop-off. The pickup didn't stop. It rammed into the back of my trailer with a sickening crunch, and I heard metal tearing as the trailer swayed dangerously over the edge. The impact threw me forward, and I fought to stay in control. I could feel the weight of the lumber shifting, the whole rig threatening to go over. I had seconds, maybe less. I didn't think. I yanked the gun out from under the seat, kicked open the door, and jumped out. I hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid the drop-off. The pickup's engine was still running, the headlights casting an eerie glow over the scene. I scrambled to my feet, the gun in my hand, and turned to face the pickup. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in grease and grime, his clothes tattered, hanging off him like they'd been through hell. He didn't say a word, just started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I leveled the gun at him, my hands shaking. "Stay back!" I shouted, but he kept coming. Closer now, I could see his face. It was twisted, scarred, like he'd been in 100 fights and lost every one of them. His eyes were cold, empty, like there was nothing human left inside him. He didn't stop. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and the man staggered but didn't go down. He looked at me, more surprised than hurt, and then kept coming. I fired again, and this time he dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt. But he wasn't dead. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife, and lunged at me. I fired a third time, hitting him square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, finally still. I stood there, gasping for breath, the gun still in my hand. The night was silent now, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I walked over to the pickup, looking for any sign of why he'd chased me, but there was nothing. The cab was empty, no ID, no belongings, just a truck that shouldn't have been running. I looked back at the man, his body lying lifeless on the ground. There was no question he was dead. I had the gun, the spent shells, and his blood on my hands. This wasn't something I could just drive away from. But as I stood there, I realized something else. The rig was teetering on the edge, the weight of the lumber pulling it closer to the drop-off. I ran back to it, climbed inside, and slowly, carefully backed it away from the edge. Once I was clear, I drove back to the main road, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I found a diner that was still open. I sat in a booth, the gun hidden in my jacket, and ordered a coffee. The waitress gave me a strange look, but didn't say anything. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not even the cops. When they eventually found the man's body a few days later, the newspapers called it a tragic accident. An unidentified man found dead in the woods. They never connected it to me, and I never offered up any information. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and got back on the road. The sun was starting to rise, and I had miles to go before my next stop. As I drove, I tried not to think about the man or why he'd come after me. It didn't matter now. He was dead, and I was still alive. That was enough.